Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. When I was 16, I lived with my dad in a small rental house on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest one-story place with 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a tiny kitchen that always smelled like old wood, and creaky floorboards that groaned no matter how light you tried to step. My room was in the back corner of the house, next to the utility room where the washer and dryer were. It wasn't big, just enough space for a bed, a small desk, and a tall, narrow dresser that had seen better days. My closet was the sliding door kind, the kind that rattled a little every time you opened it too fast. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m. My dad had already gone to bed a while ago. I could hear the muffled buzz of his TV from across the house. He always fell asleep with it on, usually some old action movie or reruns of those survival shows he liked. I was tired but restless, lying in bed scrolling through my phone under the covers. The blinds were cracked just a little, letting in a slice of moonlight that fell across my carpet like a narrow beam. It lit up just enough of the room to see outlines and shapes, but not enough to feel comfortable. That kind of halfway dark where you think you see things out of the corner of your eye, but you're never really sure. Eventually, I set my phone on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and laid on my side facing the wall, pulling the covers up to my shoulders. The hum of the house settled around me, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant drone of the TV in my dad's room, the occasional creak of the roof cooling down after a hot day. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, where every sound feels louder than it should be. I don't know how long I had been laying there when I felt it. It wasn't subtle. The mattress shifted slightly, just enough to make me freeze. It was like someone sat down gently at the foot of the bed. I heard the springs creak under the pressure, and I felt the weight settle. Not hard, not sudden, just deliberate. Slow, controlled. My heart immediately jumped into my throat. I didn't move right away. I just stayed still listening. The room was dead silent now. My dad's TV had gone quiet. I hadn't even noticed when it stopped. That made everything worse. I was laying on my right side, facing the wall, my back to the foot of the bed where the weight was. Every instinct in my body screamed not to move, but I couldn't help it. I had to look. So, slowly, I shifted just enough to half sit up and half turn, keeping the blanket mostly over me like it might somehow protect me. That's when I saw it. There was a figure sitting at the edge of the bed. I couldn't make out details, but it had a human shape, hunched over, like its shoulders were slumped, arms resting on its knees maybe. The moonlight through the blinds shimmered across it in a strange way, almost like heat waves rising off asphalt, but darker. Like how the predator looks in those movies, kind of blending into the background, but still visible in a weird shimmering shadow way. I couldn't tell if it was wearing anything, or if it was even solid. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just sat there, turned slightly away from me, like it didn't care I was there. I froze completely. Every hair on my body stood up. My skin was ice cold, and my mouth went dry. I didn't even want to breathe. I just stared at it, wide-eyed, my chest barely moving as I tried not to make any noise. The fear wasn't like anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't even panic. It was deeper than that. Primal. Like something in me knew this wasn't supposed to be happening, and I was in real danger. I didn't know what to do. My body was locked up with fear. I just kept watching, hoping maybe it would fade or move, or give me some kind of sign. But it didn't. It stayed there, completely still. I didn't want to disturb it. I don't know why, but something told me not to let it know I saw it. So I slowly, as carefully as I could, laid back down. I kept my head turned just enough that I could still see it out of the corner of my eye. It didn't react. It didn't turn. It didn't make a sound. I lay like that for what felt like forever. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I started to cry a little, silent tears that just leaked out while I held my breath. I was too scared to wipe them. My body was trembling under the covers, and I felt trapped, paralyzed between fight and flight, but unable to do either. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, but maybe it was 10 minutes, I felt the weight shift again. The mattress eased back up slowly, like someone standing up without wanting to make noise. I didn't hear any footsteps. Nothing touched me, but I knew it wasn't there anymore. I didn't move. I stayed frozen, listening to the silence. It was like the house had died around me. No creaks, no pipes, no wind outside, no bugs, no nothing. Just an oppressive quiet that pressed down on me like a blanket. Then, after maybe a minute, I heard something that made me sit up fast. My closet. The hangers inside jingled all at once, like someone had brushed past them quickly. Not a breeze. Not the house settling. It was too distinct. Too clear. It was metal on metal, a sharp little sound that snapped through the silence and made my blood run cold. I ripped the covers off and turned toward the closet. The door was half open. Not wide, just enough that the moonlight caught the edge of it. I was breathing fast now, adrenaline pushing me to move, even though my legs didn't want to. I flicked on the lamp next to my bed and stood up. The closet was empty, or at least no one was in it. But on the floor, scattered messily, were a few of my shirts and one pair of pants that I definitely hung up earlier that day. I was the kind of kid who kept things neat, not obsessive, but my clothes were always hung up or folded. I didn't throw stuff on the floor, and I was sure they hadn't been there before I went to bed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the light on and sat up in bed with my back to the wall, staring at the closet, jumping at every tiny sound. Around 4 in the morning, I finally dozed off sitting up, only to wake up to sunlight spilling across the floor. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I had sleep paralysis or a nightmare and didn't realize it. Maybe I was half awake and my brain filled in the gaps. That's what I wanted to believe. I really did, but I couldn't explain the weight on the bed. I couldn't explain the sound of the closet hangers. And I definitely couldn't explain the clothes that had fallen, because I sure as hell hadn't put them on the floor. For the next few weeks, I didn't sleep with the lights off. My dad noticed, of course, but I told him I was just having trouble sleeping. I didn't want to sound crazy, and he wasn't the type to believe in anything weird. We didn't have much of a relationship to begin with. He worked a lot, kept to himself, and let me do my own thing. But after that night, I couldn't relax in that house anymore. Every creak in the floor, every flicker of a shadow, every sound at night, it all made my heart jump. I checked the closet every night before bed. Sometimes I'd even leave the door wide open, so I could see inside from my bed. I kept the blinds shut tight, too. No more moonlight casting weird shapes across the floor. My sleep got worse, not better. I'd wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, sweating and wide-eyed. I never saw the figure again, but that made it worse in a way, because I never got answers. It just happened once, and then never again. I didn't really tell anyone the full story until years later. A few friends here and there, after I'd moved out and gone off to college. Some believed me, most didn't. And honestly, I don't care either way. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I don't think it was a ghost. I don't think it was anything supernatural. I don't really believe in that kind of stuff. I think maybe someone was in the house. Maybe someone found a way in and was hiding. The closet connected to the crawl space through a little access panel at the back. I found that out years later, during a bad winter when my dad had to get under the house to fix some plumbing. That thought makes me sick now. The idea that someone could have been living in the crawl space, watching us, coming and going while we slept. I still don't know how they would have gotten in without us hearing. The house had locks, nothing was broken, no windows were open. But that's the most logical explanation I can come up with. Someone sneaked in, sat on my bed for who knows why. Maybe they thought I was asleep and wanted to rest. Maybe they were just watching. Maybe they were trying to scare me. Or maybe it was some mentally ill drifter who didn't even know what they were doing. That scares me more than any ghost story. The real people. The ones who move in silence and don't leave any trace. The ones you don't notice until it's too late. We didn't live in that house much longer. My dad lost the lease the next spring when the landlord decided to sell. We moved into a small apartment near his work, and I never saw that house again. Good riddance. To this day, I double-check every door and window before bed. I keep a baseball bat next to my nightstand, and I sleep light. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I felt someone sit at the edge of the bed. And for a split second, I'm 16 again, staring at a shimmering outline in the dark, too scared to move, too afraid to find out if it's really there. And maybe that's the worst part, not knowing, not being able to prove it, living with the memory of something that might have been real, or might have been just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I know I didn't imagine it. I woke up on a Saturday morning, the sunlight already streaming through the half-open blinds of my bedroom. It was earlier than usual, but I felt strangely awake, as if there was something pulling me out of bed. I hadn't planned on doing anything that day. No plans, no errands, just another weekend of lounging around. But instead, I found myself walking down the stairs, grabbing my shoes, and heading out the door. It wasn't like me to just go for a walk. My weekends were normally filled with video games or hanging out with my family. But this day, I felt this strange pull, a kind of urge I couldn't ignore. It was an odd feeling, like my body was moving without my permission, and I didn't know why. The walk started slow, just me moving aimlessly down the street. As I passed the park near my house, something clicked in my brain. I wasn't sure why, but I thought of him. The boy I had been friends with in 7th grade, the one I hadn't heard from in years. I hadn't even thought about him in a long time, not since he'd left school and moved away. But as I stood there, staring at the park, I just knew. I had to go. I walked a little faster now, heading toward the area I remembered. He used to hang out there with his friends. He always had this way of being in the moment, as though time didn't exist when we were together. I remember how we met, back in 7th grade, when we were both recovering from surgery. I had my leg surgery after I broke my leg in a ridiculous accident. He had been through something far worse, a series of surgeries to fix a hole in his spine. We both spent a lot of time recovering, lying in bed or on crutches. We found each other in the school hallways after that. He had this funny way of making me laugh, even when things were tough, and I appreciated that more than anything. We became close, really close. We swapped stories about what we'd gone through, helped each other with schoolwork, even came up with dumb pranks to pull on people. He was the first person I trusted enough to tell my secrets to, things I hadn't even shared with my own family. There was a bond there that I never expected, but it was there all the same. Then, at the start of 8th grade, he left school. His family moved to a new district. I don't remember why, but it felt like the world just changed overnight. We never stayed in touch. We didn't have social media like people do now, so there were no texts, no emails. He was just gone. I didn't see him again until the end of my 10th grade year. But that Saturday morning, I was walking toward the park. My steps felt automatic, but there was this instinct guiding me. It was around noon when I found myself standing outside a small corner store, waiting for the traffic to clear before crossing. And then, just as I was about to cross, I saw him. It was him. I knew it immediately. His back was to me at first. He was walking out of the store, holding a few papers in his hand. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I recognized the way he walked, the way he moved. It was like nothing had changed, even though so much had. I called his name, unsure at first, almost as if I was questioning whether this was really him. He turned, and when he did, his face lit up like it always did when he saw me. The smile was just the same. We stood there for a second, both surprised. The first thing he said was, "What are you doing here?" I laughed, feeling a little nervous but happy. "I don't know, just needed to get out for a walk." He nodded, like he understood, then glanced at the papers in his hands. "I'm just paying some bills for my mom," he explained. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. We stood there, just looking at each other. It had been so long, and so much had changed in our lives, but in that moment, it didn't feel like anything had changed at all. We picked up right where we left off. We started talking about everything. School, life, the surgeries we'd had, how we were feeling now. There was so much to catch up on, so much that had been left unsaid for years. We spent hours together just talking. It was strange, but it felt right, like we'd never been apart. As the sun began to set, we knew it was time to part ways. We exchanged numbers, but I didn't think much of it. I wasn't expecting any more contact. I wasn't even sure why I was feeling this urge to reconnect, but it felt good to see him again. There was a sense of peace in the air, like the past had come full circle. The next day, Sunday, the evening was quiet. I had just finished dinner when my phone rang. The caller ID was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, it wasn't a stranger. It was his mom. The words she said next hit me like a punch to the stomach. My heart dropped into my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. "He's gone," she said, her voice trembling. "He had an accident." I couldn't understand at first. My brain just couldn't process it. "What do you mean? What happened?" She told me that he had been riding his friend's bike, just going down the road. Apparently, he didn't see the truck until it was too late. They collided. He was in a coma for 3 days before he passed away. I felt numb. I don't think I cried right away. I couldn't. It didn't feel real. We had just spent hours together the day before. He was alive. He was here, and now he was gone. I couldn't believe it. As his mom continued speaking, she told me the one thing that made everything even harder to bear. The last thing he did before he left the house, she said softly, was search the entire house for a book he borrowed from you. He wanted to return it to you. I don't know why, but that stuck with me, the image of him rifling through his house, looking for something to return to me. We hadn't talked in 4 years, hadn't shared anything beyond a couple of brief moments together. Yet, the last thing he had done in this world was search for something he had borrowed from me. The weight of that thought crushed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger here, something I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand why he'd gone through the trouble of finding that book after all this time. And I couldn't shake the feeling that his decision to see me that day, the strange urge I had to go to the park, was somehow tied to what happened next. I felt like I should have known, like I should have seen the signs, done something differently. But I didn't, and I couldn't undo it. It haunted me. The fact that I hadn't seen him in so long, that I'd just randomly decided to meet him the day before his accident, that we had talked for hours like nothing was wrong. And then, just like that, he was gone. I refused to drive for months after that. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe if he hadn't been on that bike, maybe if he hadn't gotten on the road that day, things would have been different. It made me question everything about fate, about how small moments can change the course of everything. What if I hadn't gone to the park that day? What if I had walked a different way? Or if I hadn't even left the house at all? The thought that he had been searching for that book, something so small, something so trivial, kept coming back to me. Why did he do that? And why, of all things, was it my book? It still bothers me. The idea that something so insignificant in the grand scheme of things could be so important in the last moments of someone's life. I'll never know why he did that, but I think maybe it's because he wanted to make sure he had returned everything. That even after everything we'd been through, there was still something he needed to do before he left. Maybe he was trying to make peace with things in a way I didn't understand. I don't know, but every time I get behind the wheel, I think about that day. I think about how things could have been different, how we could have been in touch, how we could have talked more. I think about how the smallest things, the little moments we forget, are the ones that stick with us the longest. And I'll never forget that day, the last time I saw him, the last time he was alive. I was just a kid back then, probably around 6 or 7 years old. My parents worked a lot, and because of their odd schedules, I spent most of my time alone at home. My mom worked day shifts, and my dad worked nights. So while my dad slept during the day, I had the entire house to myself. It was like a little world where I could do whatever I wanted, no rules, no one watching over me. It was quiet, and I liked it for the most part, even though, after a while, the silence began to get to me. There were days when I'd get really bored. After a few hours of watching cartoons or playing with my toys, I'd end up wandering into my room with the house phone in my hands, looking for something new to entertain myself. The phone wasn't like the ones you see today. It was a big, clunky thing, white with a long cord that stretched and twisted around the kitchen like a snake. But it was my best friend when I was alone. I had no idea what I was doing half the time, just pressing random buttons and watching the numbers flash on the little screen. Sometimes, if I pressed too many buttons, I'd get someone on the other end, but most of the time, I'd just hear a dial tone before it disconnected. At first, I didn't really know the concept of calling strangers or what it really meant. I just thought it was fun to press the numbers and hear a voice, even if I didn't know who it was. It became a game for me, and it made the empty house feel less lonely. One afternoon, I picked up the phone again. I don't remember what led me to do it, but I remember being bored and thinking, why not? I had done it 100 times before. I pressed a few numbers, waited for the sound of the dial tone to stop, and then someone picked up. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't recognize the voice on the other end. It was deep, smooth, and kind of slow, but I didn't think much of it. "Hello," he said. His voice was warm, like someone you might hear in a movie, a voice that would make you trust them immediately. "Hi," I said. "Who is this?" There was a pause, just a little bit too long for comfort, and then he spoke again. "I'm Santa." I didn't know how to react at first. Santa? I had never heard of anyone who'd just pick up the phone and say they were Santa. It didn't make sense, but I was young and gullible, so I believed him right away. I didn't even think to ask how he had my number. My imagination went wild. The idea that Santa Claus was on the phone with me, personally, it was the best thing that could have happened to a kid like me. I immediately started bombarding him with questions, one after the other. What's your favorite reindeer? What does the North Pole look like? Do you really ride in a sleigh? How do you deliver presents to everyone in one night? I was asking every question I could think of, and he just kept answering them. He sounded so convincing, and the answers he gave were so detailed and confident, I had no reason to doubt him. The conversation went on for what felt like forever, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. At some point, I even told him I wanted a bike for Christmas, and he promised me I'd get one, which made me even more excited. But that's when things started to feel off. After answering all my questions, there was a long silence. I thought maybe the call had ended, but then he spoke again. There's just one thing, he said, and his voice took on a more serious tone. One of the elves has misplaced your address. I didn't fully understand what he meant at first. I remember thinking, that's weird. I didn't know why it was such a big deal. I was just a little kid, after all. He continued, if I don't have your address, how can I bring you your presents? You need to tell me where you live, or you won't get any presents this year. I froze. At that moment, I realized I didn't actually know my address. I was too young to remember it, and no one had ever really explained it to me. I had never needed to know. My parents always took care of that stuff. But now, with Santa telling me that if I didn't give him my address, I wouldn't get any presents, I started to panic. I remember my heart racing. My mind was racing, too, trying to come up with the address, trying to remember something I'd never had to memorize. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing came to mind. I couldn't remember the street name, the number, or anything that made sense. I felt this wave of dread wash over me, something deep in my gut that told me I had to do something fast, but I couldn't think of what that something was. In a blind panic, I ran out of my room and down the hallway, straight to my parents' bedroom. My dad was still asleep, snoring lightly in his bed, and I started shaking him, yelling, Santa needs our address. He needs our address. At the time, I didn't realize how stupid it sounded, but it felt urgent, and I was so caught up in the panic that I couldn't stop. My dad was groggy and annoyed, but when I wouldn't stop yelling, he finally ripped himself out of bed, clearly frustrated. What the hell is wrong with you? He muttered as he grabbed the phone from my hands. But by then, it was too late. Santa had already hung up. My dad didn't seem too concerned. He wasn't the type to really entertain the idea of someone pretending to be Santa on the phone. Don't touch the phone again, he said, his voice stern. Go to bed. I didn't understand at the time why my dad was so mad or why he seemed so calm about it. All I knew was that I was scared. The fear didn't go away, even when I was tucked into bed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about that call. The man had sounded too convincing, too familiar. The way he spoke, the way he didn't seem to care when I said I didn't know my address. Everything about the call felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. The next few days passed, and I tried to forget about it, but I kept thinking about it. I couldn't get the conversation out of my head, the way the man had manipulated me into feeling like I had to give him my address. I told my mom about it a few days later, but she just laughed it off. It was probably just some prankster, she said, brushing it off like it was nothing. Don't worry about it. I tried not to worry about it, but there was a small part of me that still couldn't shake the unease. That feeling lingered for weeks, and after that, I was never allowed to use the phone by myself again. Looking back, I wonder how many other kids fell for the same thing. How many times that same man, or someone like him, pretended to be Santa and manipulated kids into giving up their personal information. It's a terrifying thought. And for years, I've wondered if that man was actually just some random person looking to take advantage of a vulnerable child, or if he had other, darker intentions. Even now, thinking back on it, it still creeps me out. There are moments when I still remember the way his voice sounded, how confident he was, and how he used something as innocent as Christmas to prey on a child's trust. I was just a kid, and I didn't know any better. It wasn't until much later that I realized just how dangerous that situation could have been. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was something sinister about that call. Something that went beyond just a harmless prank. Something darker. Something that makes me feel a sense of dread every time I think about it. I never did find out who that man was, but the memory of that phone call, the strange and twisted way he used Santa Claus to manipulate me, still haunts me to this day. I'll never forget it. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was packed. It seemed like there were more of us than the house could handle, with relatives spilling into every corner. My aunt's house wasn't small, but with a big extended family, there was barely room to move. The kitchen was buzzing, the scent of tamales and arroz con pollo filling the air. There was music playing on both floors, and the lights were on in every single room. It felt like the whole house was alive with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The time seemed to fly by, and before I knew it, it was well past midnight. We were all a little tipsy, and the kids had started playing hide and seek upstairs while the adults mingled downstairs. I was still caught up in the excitement, running around with my cousins, but as the hours stretched on, things started to quiet down. A sudden stillness swept over the house, and just as I was settling into the peace, the lights flickered once, twice, and then nothing. The power went out. At first, no one seemed to panic. There were murmurs of confusion, some jokes about how the tamales had finally overloaded the fuse box. But when the silence really hit, when the house was plunged into a thick, quiet darkness, an unsettling tension began to grow. People began calling out for flashlights, for someone to check the breaker, but no one was eager to go down into the cellar. That's when my uncle, Tito, turned to me. Tito was a big guy, sturdy and steady in almost every situation. He volunteered to check the fuse box in the cellar, and without much thought, I agreed to go with him. I was 8 years old and, in a way, still excited by the adventure of it all. Besides, I trusted Tito. He'd always been the kind of person who could handle anything. I thought it was no big deal. We walked toward the back of the kitchen, through the door that led to the cellar. The air was heavier in the back of the house, and the darkness seemed to be swallowing everything. The light from the kitchen barely reached the door, so by the time we made it to the stairs, I felt like I was stepping into a pit of black ink. My hand instinctively found Tito's shoulder, and I kept close behind him as we descended. The wooden steps creaked under our feet, adding to the eerie stillness. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar was worse than I'd imagined. There was a small, high window on the far wall, but the night outside was just as dark. No moonlight, no streetlights, just complete, absolute darkness. It felt suffocating. Tito paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. I followed his lead, but it didn't help much. The cellar was pitch black, and I couldn't even make out the outline of the walls. My hand was still pressed on Tito's shoulder, guiding me forward, though I was beginning to feel uneasy. There was something off about this place. I couldn't explain it at the time, but I felt like something was wrong, like we shouldn't be here. The silence was thick, and the only sounds were the quiet shuffle of our feet on the dirt floor and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above us. We walked a few steps further when we heard something, a rustle, followed by a soft thump. It came from somewhere ahead of us, near the corner where the fuse box was located. I froze. Tito didn't react at first, but I could feel his body tense beneath my hand. We both stood there in the dark, listening, straining to hear more. I thought maybe it was a rat or a mouse. The house was old, and there had been signs of rodents now and then. Tito didn't say anything, and neither did I. I didn't want to sound scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We moved forward again, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to keep my hand on Tito's shoulder, just to remind myself that we weren't completely alone in this vast darkness. As we took another 5 steps, a sharp, slapping sound broke the silence. It echoed through the cellar, like a hand striking flesh. I jumped, and I could feel Tito's body jerk in front of me. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low but tense. I nodded quickly, unsure if it had really happened. I thought it was probably just the house settling, or maybe some rats scurrying around. But Tito's voice shook when he spoke again. "Did you slap me?" I blinked in confusion. "What?" "No." His hand went to his back, rubbing at the spot between his shoulder blades. It felt like I just got slapped. Hard. I didn't know how to respond. We were alone down here, right? And if either of us had slapped him, I would have felt it or heard it in the silence. But Tito wasn't the type of guy to make things up. I had no idea what to say. We pressed on, though the unease in my stomach was growing. Every sound, every rustle of the air felt amplified in the darkness. We reached the far wall, and Tito found the fuse box. He flipped the switch, and the faint hum of power returned to the house. The lights flickered on, and we could hear the sounds of the party resuming upstairs. I was relieved when we climbed back up the stairs. The feeling of being down there, exposed and in the dark, lingered even when we returned to the light. No one seemed to think much of the power going out. It was a small inconvenience. People were already back to eating, laughing, and talking. But Tito was quiet. He kept rubbing the back of his neck, almost absent-mindedly. It wasn't like him to act so distracted, especially when we were back among family. At first, I thought maybe it was just a result of the weird experience down there, but as time passed, it became more noticeable. His wife, Carmen, noticed it too. She asked him if he was okay, but he brushed it off. But then, as the evening went on, he started complaining more about the sensation in his back. It wasn't just a dull ache. He described it as this sharp, almost prickling sensation, like static electricity, or the tingling feeling you get when your arm falls asleep. Carmen didn't like the sound of that, and she asked him to lift his shirt to take a look. It was when he did that we all froze. On his back, just beneath his left shoulder blade, there was a handprint, a red, distinct mark. It wasn't just a rash or a bruise, it was a clear, outlined handprint. The fingers were visible, as though someone had placed their palm flat against his back and pressed hard. Everyone went silent. Carmen gasped, and some of my older relatives started murmuring in the background. People moved closer to get a better look, their voices low, almost fearful. I didn't understand at first. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was from something else. Maybe it was a reaction to the cold, or a mark from the way he'd been carrying things downstairs. But no one had touched him down there, not in that way. And the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. As the night went on, the house buzzed with tension. Some of my relatives, especially the older ones, began to talk in hushed tones. They whispered about the mark, about the weird sensation Tito had felt, and the slapping sound we'd heard in the cellar. It was then that one of my uncles, who was deeply rooted in our culture and its superstitions, made a suggestion that sent chills down my spine. He said the handprint, the sound, and the feeling could only mean one thing. It wasn't just a random noise. It wasn't just some odd coincidence. It was a sign. He said it was a demon, that something had followed us down into the cellar, that it had touched Tito. I tried to dismiss it, but my mind kept going back to the feeling in that dark cellar, the sensation of being watched, the sensation that something was there with us, something we couldn't see or understand. The more I thought about it, the more unnerving it became. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Was it a trick of the mind, a reaction to being in complete darkness for so long? Was it some kind of strange, unexplained phenomenon? Maybe. But the thing that still haunts me isn't just the handprint or the strange sensations we felt. It's the fact that whatever happened, whatever was in that cellar with us, was able to get close to us without us even realizing it. We were exposed, vulnerable. And something got in between us, something that shouldn't have been there at all. It was one of those nights where everything seemed calm, the kind of evening where you feel like you've got everything under control. My husband worked night shifts, and I usually stayed up late waiting for him. His shifts were long, stretching into the early morning hours, and I always knew that when he finally came home, I'd be in a deep sleep by then. I tried to make the most of my evenings with the kids, keeping things quiet and simple. This particular night, I had decided to let my 2 kids watch a movie in my bed. They were already acting a bit hyper, as they usually did when it got late, so I figured letting them watch something would calm them down before bedtime. I had just finished locking up the house, making sure every door and window was secure. Everything was set. It was around 10 p.m., so I assumed they'd fall asleep soon enough, and they could just stay in my bed that night. The house was quiet except for the soft glow of the laptop screen lighting up the room. I had my door cracked open just an inch, enough to let in a sliver of light from the dining room. The dining room light stayed on for my husband, a routine of sorts, a habit I had gotten into over the years. We'd always kept that light on for him. He was used to coming home in the dark after a long drive, and it seemed to make him feel like the house was waiting for him. As I sat there, getting comfortable in bed, the sound of the movie filled the room. My kids were quiet, focusing on the screen, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd fall asleep early. About 40 minutes into the movie, I heard it, a sound that immediately made me freeze. Footsteps. Clear footsteps coming from the dining room, just on the other side of the door. My room was directly off the dining room, and we had hardwood floors, so it was easy to hear when someone walked around. The floorboards creaked faintly with each step, and the sound was unmistakable. I figured it was just my husband, maybe coming home early. He was known for doing that sometimes, trying to sneak in before I had a chance to go to sleep. So, I didn't think much of it at first, just listening to the rhythmic sound of footsteps pacing back and forth across the dining room. I waited a few minutes, thinking he would come in and say something, like he usually did after a long shift, but there was no sign of him. The footsteps kept going, back and forth. My heart started to pick up pace, a strange sensation creeping up my spine. It felt wrong somehow. After 5 minutes of hearing the same sound, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I paused the movie, told the kids to stay put, and slowly got out of bed. My mind raced as I walked to the door and opened it just a crack. The moment I did, the footsteps stopped. Completely. I stood there, staring out into the dining room. The light from the hallway filtered through the crack in the door, casting long shadows across the room. But there was no one there. No husband, no sound. Just silence. My pulse quickened as I stepped into the hallway, glancing toward the living room and the kitchen. The house felt eerily still, as if everything had frozen in time. I checked the dining room first. Nothing. I walked over to the living room, looked in all corners, and even peeked out the front window, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. I moved quickly through the house, checking every room, every closet. Every window was locked, just as I had left them. The back door was secure. The front door was locked, the deadbolt in place. Nothing was out of place. Still, that feeling of unease gnawed at me. Something wasn't right. The sound of the footsteps, it wasn't just the oddity of hearing someone walking through my house when I was supposed to be alone. It was the fact that it had stopped the instant I opened the door. Whoever it was, if it had been someone, they were no longer there. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe it was the wind or the house settling. Or maybe, just maybe, I was letting my imagination run wild. That's when I heard it. A soft meow. I froze. The sound came from the direction of the kitchen. A soft, almost insistent meow, like our cat was standing there, waiting for me to feed him. I sighed in relief, embarrassed at myself. Of course, it was just the cat. I must have been imagining the whole thing. I laughed softly and turned toward the kitchen. I was so focused on the sound of the meowing that I didn't even notice what was missing until I reached the kitchen door. Our cat wasn't there. I stood there for a second, staring at the empty kitchen. The meowing had come from the back porch, I realized. I rushed to the back door, my heart sinking again. It was still locked. I quickly unlocked it and opened it, and there he was, sitting calmly outside on the porch, staring up at me with his usual lazy gaze. He didn't seem to care about the door I had just opened, or the fact that I'd been looking for him inside. I stood there for a moment, completely stunned. How had he gotten out there? The door had been locked from the inside, and I hadn't heard him meow while he was inside. I had checked every window, every door, every possible exit, and there was no way he could have gotten out without me hearing it. Yet there he was, sitting as casually as could be, tail flicking back and forth. I closed the door behind me quickly, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling in. It had to be a mistake. It had to be some weird coincidence. Maybe the cat had slipped out while I wasn't paying attention. But the thought of how close I had been to finding nothing in the house, and how I'd heard those footsteps earlier, made my stomach twist. That's when my phone rang. My husband. I quickly picked it up, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was still creeping up my spine. "Hey babe," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out higher than usual. "Hey, just wanted to make sure you locked up," he said, his voice distant but calm. A neighbor's house got broken into a couple streets over today. They didn't get anything, but it's a reminder to lock up tight, especially with everything going on lately. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My hands started to shake as the words sank in. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said, still unaware of the full impact of what he was telling me. "Make sure everything's locked up, okay?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes, and before I knew it, I was sobbing. I felt utterly terrified, overwhelmed by the realization that something was wrong. I had heard footsteps. My cat had been outside, but the door had been locked. The entire house had been secure. And then, just moments later, I was being told about a break-in just a few blocks away. It was too much for me. I'd been trying to tell myself that it was nothing, but deep down I knew. I knew someone had been in the house with us. They had walked through the dining room, and I had heard it. But by the time I checked, they were gone, slipping out like shadows into the night. I sat down on the floor, clutching the phone to my ear, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My kids were still in my bed, oblivious to the growing sense of dread that filled the house. My husband, on the other end of the phone, still didn't understand. "Babe, you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, concern finally creeping in. "I'm fine," I said, wiping my eyes and trying to steady my breath. "But I don't feel safe here. I don't know what's going on." I heard footsteps, and I checked the house, and everything was locked, but then the cat was outside. "I just don't know, Mike. I don't feel right. I'm on my way home," he said quickly. "I'll be there soon." I hung up, feeling a little better, knowing that he was on his way. But the unease didn't leave me. I spent the next few minutes pacing, glancing around the house, double-checking locks, looking over my shoulder as if I might catch a glimpse of someone lurking in the corners. By the time my husband arrived, it was nearly 7 a.m. The house was still dark, and the air felt heavy with tension. He came in, gave me a hug, and told me everything was going to be okay, but I could tell he didn't understand the full weight of what I was feeling. We went through the house again together, checking every lock, every door, every window. Everything was secure. Nothing seemed out of place. But the feeling of someone having been there, of having walked through my house while I was alone with my kids, lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't until much later, when I had time to process everything, that I realized how close we had come. I thought about the break-in down the street, the sound of the footsteps, and the fact that our cat had been outside when I knew the door had been locked. It all pointed to one conclusion. We had been lucky that night. Someone had been watching. Someone had been close. And next time, they might not leave so easily. I was 7 years old, and Saturdays were the best days in the world. I remember how every Friday night, I would lay out my little clothes for the next morning. Jeans that were just a bit too long, a t-shirt with a faded cartoon on the front, and my old sneakers that squeaked a little when I walked on tile. I never cared how early we had to get up. I never whined about being tired. Saturdays were sacred, not because of cartoons or pancakes or playing with my siblings, but because Saturday morning meant riding shotgun with my dad. Back then, my dad worked a lot. He had a full-time job during the week, and then, to bring in some extra money, he picked up a weekend gig delivering computer parts for a local tech company. I didn't really understand what the parts were for or who needed them, but I knew it involved a 2-hour route that started early and ended just before lunch. And once a week, usually every other Saturday, he would let me come along. That 2-hour trip was everything to me. It made me feel important, grown up, like I was part of something special. I wasn't just a passenger, I was co-pilot. There was a tradition too, one that felt more official than anything else in my childhood. Once we hit the road, about 15 minutes in, there was a small Easy Mart just off the highway. It wasn't anything fancy, just a grimy convenience store with flickering lights and faded advertisements stuck to the windows. But to me, it was magic. Dad would let me pick out one thing every time. Without fail, I got a pack of pink extra gum and one of those ice cream cones they kept in the little freezer by the register. The kind wrapped in thin paper with the soggy wafer and the hard chocolate top. It was never a question. I don't even think I ever looked at anything else. That gum and that cone were part of the ride. That particular Saturday started the same way as all the others. I remember waking up excited, the kind of excited where you don't even need an alarm. The sun wasn't fully up yet, just a pale glow starting to push through the blinds. I pulled on my clothes, brushed my teeth without being told, and ran into the kitchen, practically buzzing. My mom was already up, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, flipping through the newspaper like she always did. The house smelled like toast. I remember telling her goodbye like I always did, bouncing on my toes, too eager to stay still. She smiled and told me to be good, and I said something back. I don't remember what, maybe I will. Or love you. And then I walked to the front door. But something happened the moment I got to the threshold. I stopped. It was like hitting a wall, but nothing was there. I just stood there, staring out at the driveway where my dad's old Bronco was waiting. I remember how the porch light glowed in the cold air, and how the trees across the street looked kind of fuzzy in the morning haze. Everything looked normal, but something in my chest locked up. I felt it in my arms, my throat, my legs. This thick, sticky feeling like fear was wrapping around me from the inside. Then I started crying. Not just a little sniffle or whine. I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. My mom must have dropped whatever she was holding, because suddenly she was next to me, holding my shoulders, asking what was wrong. But I didn't know. I couldn't explain it. I just remember clutching the door frame, not letting her pull me forward, sobbing like I was being dragged to my death. It felt like something terrible would happen if I walked out that door. I didn't know what or why, but it felt real. As real as anything I'd ever felt. She told me it was okay, that I didn't have to go, and brought me back into the kitchen. I sat at the table while she made eggs and toast. I remember trying to calm down, my chest hiccuping with the last of the sobs. I couldn't stop looking at the door, half expecting something to come through it. But nothing happened. The sun kept rising, the street stayed quiet, and I started playing with my Barbies on the floor like it was just another morning. My mom didn't push me or ask too many questions. She just let it go. About an hour later, the phone rang. I remember the tone in her voice changing as she answered. At first she sounded normal, polite, but then her voice dropped. Quiet, flat. I looked up from my dolls. She said okay a few times and then we'll come. When she hung up, she didn't say anything right away. Just stood there with one hand on the counter, staring at the floor. When she finally told me what happened, I didn't fully understand. I don't think I even cried. I just listened. My dad had been driving the Bronco on his usual route. It was an older model, a boxy thing with peeling paint, and a rattling back window that never quite closed all the way. He'd been driving on a back road, the kind with wide ditches and narrow shoulders, heading to drop off one of his first deliveries. According to what he later told us, he'd heard something in the back seat, like a thump or a bump, something that made him turn around for just a second. But when he looked back, there was nothing there. When he turned back to the road, it was too late. There was a mailbox, an old metal one on a thick wooden post, and he overcorrected to avoid hitting it. The Bronco swerved hard, wheels catching the loose gravel at the edge. It rolled 3 times. 3 full rolls across the road before it landed on its side in a shallow ditch. He crawled out through the driver's side window, bruised, bleeding, dazed. The paramedics later said it was a miracle he walked away. The entire passenger side of the vehicle, the side I would have been sitting on, was crushed in, completely smashed, bent inward like a soda can someone had stepped on. The seat was mangled. The dashboard had folded in half. If anyone had been sitting there, they wouldn't have stood a chance. The only thing they found in the passenger seat, among the broken glass and scattered parts, was a pink package of extra gum. It's hard to explain what I felt when I heard that. My mom just kept looking at me, like she was trying to read something on my face. I don't know if she was waiting for me to say something or cry again or what. I just remember feeling cold, like the kind of cold that comes from the inside. I didn't know how to think about what had happened. I didn't know how close I had come to dying, or what it meant that I hadn't gone. At that age, death wasn't something I understood, but I understood fear. And I understood that something had kept me from getting in that car. We went to see the Bronco a few days later, after it had been towed to a lot outside town. My dad was sore and moving slow, his arm in a sling. I remember standing on my tiptoes to look through the fence. The vehicle didn't even look real. The roof was caved in, the windows gone. The metal on the passenger side was torn and folded like paper. The front tire on that side was bent under the car at an angle that didn't make sense. My dad stood there next to me, silent. He didn't say anything about how lucky he was or how bad it could have been. He just kept staring at the wreckage. At one point, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. It was the pack of gum. The plastic wrapper was scuffed and torn on one side, but the gum inside was still there. Pink, neat little sticks in a row. He didn't give it to me, just held it in his hand, like he didn't know what to do with it. Then he slipped it back in his pocket, and we drove home in my mom's car. After that, I didn't ride with him anymore. He quit the delivery job not long after, said it wasn't worth the extra money. I think the crash shook him more than he let on. I don't remember us talking about it much after that. Life just kept moving. I went back to playing with Barbies, going to school, worrying about things like spelling tests and birthday parties. But every now and then, I'd think about that morning, about how I'd stood at the door and couldn't make myself walk out. I used to wonder what would have happened if I had ignored that feeling. If my mom had pushed me, or if I had just kept walking like every other Saturday. I used to think it was just luck, a coincidence. Maybe I was coming down with something and didn't realize it. Maybe I was just tired, but I knew it wasn't that. It was fear. Raw, bone-deep fear that I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Years went by. I grew up, moved out, got a job, made a life, but I never forgot that day. I never forgot that gum, or the way my mom looked at me when she got off the phone. I never forgot the sound of my dad's voice the first time he talked about the crash, how flat it was, how quiet. As an adult, I've looked back on that morning more times than I can count. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it in some scientific, logical way. People say kids are sensitive, that we pick up on things adults miss. That fear has a way of alerting us, even when there's no clear threat. I don't know. Maybe it's just hindsight painting everything with meaning. Maybe it was just dumb luck. But I've also thought about how fragile everything is. How a simple choice, one small moment, can be the difference between life and death. I don't think I was supposed to die that day. I don't know what made me stop. I don't know if something out there was looking out for me, or if it was just my own body screaming out a warning I couldn't understand. But I listened. I stayed home. And because I did, I'm still here. Every now and then, when I'm at a gas station or walking through a convenience store, I'll see that same pack of gum. The bright pink kind I used to beg for. I don't buy it anymore. I haven't since that day. But I always notice it. It always catches my eye, sitting there by the register, like a quiet reminder. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently. What if I had gotten in the car like I always did? Would I have screamed when the Bronco rolled? Would my dad have seen me, reached for me, tried to protect me? Would I have made it? Probably not. But I didn't go. And that single decision, made by a scared little girl for reasons she couldn't explain, saved my life. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a building that always seemed to have a strange energy to it. The walls were thin, the neighbors were constantly moving in and out, and the building was old, creaking, settling, like it was alive. My apartment, though small, was cozy enough for me to feel safe. Connected to the bedroom was a walk-in closet, a feature I had always liked because it gave me extra storage space and a bit of a retreat. At the time, I was living with my boyfriend, though we weren't exactly in the healthiest place in our relationship. Things felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We didn't argue all that often, but there were plenty of silent, tense moments. Still, I had never felt scared in my own home, until one night. It was a regular Thursday night. I had just gotten home from work, and we had spent a quiet evening together. My boyfriend and I were in bed, the lights off, the quiet of the apartment filling the space between us. The only sounds were the occasional creak from the old building and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I must have been half asleep when it happened, a loud, startling sound from the closet. It was like something heavy had fallen. At first, I thought maybe a bag had toppled off the shelf or some clothes had slipped off the rack. But the noise wasn't just a soft thud. It was a loud bang, like something had been thrown or knocked over with force. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my body tense up, breaking into a cold sweat. My mind raced, but I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I kept my eyes shut tight, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would just go away. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't want to turn over and look. What if someone was in there? What if it was some kind of intruder, or worse, something else? I pressed my face deeper into the pillow, trying to will myself back to sleep, but the sound lingered in the air, echoing in my mind. I laid there for what felt like hours, the silence in the room somehow louder than the sound had been. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I must have drifted back to sleep because the next thing I knew, morning light was pouring through the blinds. The feeling of dread from the night before still clung to me like a shadow, but I pushed it aside, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad dream or maybe the building settling. When I got up to start my day, I walked into the closet. The floor was clean, but one of the bags I had left on the shelf had fallen to the ground. I let out a nervous laugh, half relieved, half annoyed with myself for letting my imagination get the best of me. I thought it was no big deal. Maybe the bag had just slipped. After all, things fell all the time in old buildings. I shrugged it off and went on with my day, getting ready for work like nothing had happened. As I finished brushing my teeth, my ex, still asleep in bed, stirred and mumbled something about a bad dream. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd both been through a lot, and I figured it was just a random nightmare. But then he turned toward me and said something that made my blood run cold. Yeah, I had a bad dream about the closet, he said groggily, barely awake. I turned to him, still a little sleepy, but now curious. What about the closet? I saw you in there, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was trying to remember the dream. You were standing in the closet, but not just standing, walking backward, like you were facing the wall or something. But you weren't facing it, you were walking toward it backwards. I blinked at him, my mind trying to make sense of what he had just said. It didn't make sense. I hadn't gotten up in the night, and I had definitely not been walking backward in the closet. I didn't even sleepwalk. I stared at him for a moment, trying to figure out if he was joking, but his face was serious. He looked unsettled. Are you sure you were awake? I asked, my voice trembling without meaning to. Yeah, I'm sure. I woke up and saw you there, he replied, now fully awake and clearly disturbed by the memory. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't explain it, but a part of me, an uncomfortable, gut-wrenching part, wondered if something had happened while I was asleep, something that I wasn't aware of. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. But even as I thought about it, I couldn't convince myself that that was the answer. It didn't feel like a normal sleepwalking episode. There was something wrong about it. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The memory of his dream haunted me, clinging to the edges of my mind. Every time I walked past the closet, I glanced over at it, half expecting to see something strange. Years went by, and I moved on. The relationship with my ex ended in a mess of unresolved feelings, and I moved into a new apartment in the same complex, just a different unit. I thought about the closet incident from time to time, but it was easier to push it aside as something weird but ultimately unexplainable. Then, a few years later, I found myself living in that same apartment complex again, this time with my current boyfriend. Things with him were better, calmer, and I felt more at ease. Still, there was something about the apartment that made me uneasy sometimes, but I ignored it, brushing it off as paranoia. Maybe I had just been too sensitive before. One night, after a quiet evening, I woke up to the sound of my boyfriend's voice. His words startled me, and I blinked, still half asleep. So, I woke up last night and saw you standing in the closet. I froze. The blood in my veins turned to ice. He couldn't have known about the first time. I hadn't told him about it. I never had. I wasn't about to share that weird experience with him. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my brain. What? I croaked. I woke up, he continued, his tone casual, like he was telling me about his day. And I saw you standing in the closet. It was pretty dark, but I'm sure it was you. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. I wasn't in the closet, I replied, though the words sounded strange even as I said them. I didn't get up last night. Well, you were standing there, looking at the wall, he said, looking at me with a confused expression. It was kind of creepy. I thought you were sleepwalking or something. I thought maybe I was dreaming. The blood drained from my face. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. I couldn't understand what had happened. I didn't sleepwalk. I had never had any history of doing that. And yet, here he was, telling me the same thing my ex had. I kept thinking about the two incidents. It didn't make sense. How could two different people, living in two separate times and spaces, have the exact same dream about me walking backward in the closet? I didn't sleepwalk. I wasn't prone to nightmares. I hadn't done anything strange in my sleep. But the more I thought about it, the more the possibility seemed real, at least in some twisted, logical sense. Could I have been doing something in my sleep that I couldn't remember? Could I have walked into that closet both times and not even realized it? I don't know. I never will. But after that night, I couldn't bring myself to go near that closet again. It sat there, looming in the corner of the room, always in my line of sight. I didn't want to know what had happened, and I definitely didn't want to find out if it would happen again. In the end, I left the apartment. I didn't feel safe there anymore. Not after everything. The thought of the closet, and of what might have happened in the dark, was enough to make me never want to stay in that building again. I moved out, but the memories of those strange nights, of waking up to the unsettling stories from my ex and my boyfriend, stayed with me. The closet stayed with me, too, always in the back of my mind. Maybe I'll never understand what happened. Maybe it was just an odd series of events. But every time I think about it, I can't help but feel that something else was at play, something beyond my control, beyond my understanding, something I'll never be able to explain. It was one of those nights. The kind where the quiet stillness of the world feels like it could swallow you whole. I was 17, back home after a late night out. It was already past midnight when I pulled into the driveway, and I felt that familiar sense of being the last one up, the only one awake in the house. My parents were already tucked into bed, my younger siblings too. The whole place felt almost too still, as if everyone else had melted into sleep, leaving me alone in the vastness of the night. I suppose that's how I felt most nights, in that house at the edge of the woods alone. But tonight, there was something else, something off. It wasn't a feeling that I could easily describe, but it was there tugging at me. I grabbed my stuff from the car and headed inside, careful not to wake anyone. The house was dark, except for the soft glow of a night light down the hall. The air inside felt colder than usual, though it wasn't the temperature. It was just that peculiar, unnerving sense of silence. I walked to my room, trying to shake the discomfort off. I shut the door behind me, flipped on the light, and set down my things. The room was just as I'd left it, messy, with clothes scattered on the floor, books stacked on the desk, and my bed untouched, the blanket slightly askew from the last time I had hurriedly made it. I slung my jacket over the back of my chair and sat down to finish my homework. Nothing too intense, just some last-minute math and history, the kind of stuff that could easily be pushed aside. But I needed to feel like I was doing something to pass the time. After about an hour, I picked up my phone, dialed a friend, and sat back on my bed, chatting about whatever was on my mind: school, plans for the weekend, all the usual. The conversation drifted on, and I listened to music, my mind wandering as I lay back on my pillow. My cat, a chunky tabby, jumped up onto my bed and curled up next to me. I felt the familiar warmth of his body next to mine, and the rhythmic sound of his purring was oddly soothing. Eventually, the conversation with my friend wound down, and I hung up, turning off the light. It was late, but I wasn't tired yet. I spent a little more time staring up at the ceiling, the shadows of the room creeping along the walls as my mind raced with thoughts of school, friends, and everything else that seemed important at the time. But eventually, sleep overtook me, and I drifted off, the soft sounds of the house settling around me. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but suddenly, I was jerked awake by a rustling sound coming from underneath my bed. I blinked in the darkness, my heart pounding. At first, I thought it was just my cat, looking for a comfy spot to curl up in. He had a habit of sneaking under the bed at night, probably to avoid the constant attention I gave him during the day. But then the rustling continued, and it didn't sound like my cat at all. It sounded bigger. The movement was heavier, more deliberate. I lay there perfectly still, trying to calm my breathing, listening closely. The noise was strange. Too loud, too sharp to be my cat. I turned my head slightly, trying to peer through the darkness, but I couldn't make out anything. The only thing I could hear now was my own heart thumping in my chest. My first thought was that it was probably some sort of animal. Maybe a raccoon or a possum had gotten into the house through the open window. But as the rustling continued, my mind started to wander down darker paths. What if it was something bigger? A coyote maybe? Or worse, what if it was some sort of wild animal that had gotten in and was now hiding under my bed? It's not like I lived far from the woods. The forest was right outside, and it was a common sight to see wild animals in the area. But still, it was hard to ignore that creeping sense of unease that was crawling up my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overreacting. I was just tired, and my imagination was running wild. But as I lay there, the noise under my bed didn't stop. It got louder, closer. Something was moving beneath me, and it was definitely not a small animal. 5 minutes passed, maybe more. The rustling grew louder, and with it, the panic inside me started to rise. My breaths came faster as I fought the urge to look. I told myself it was fine. It was nothing, but I knew it wasn't nothing. I couldn't stay still any longer. I had to look. I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I rolled over, trying to make as little noise as possible. My heart pounded in my ears as I shifted toward the edge of the bed. My body trembled, but I forced myself to stay quiet, to stay calm. I leaned over the side of the bed, looking down through the small gap between the mattress and the bed frame. What I saw next is something I will never forget. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The dim light from the hallway didn't reach far enough into my room to help me make sense of it. But there, beneath my bed, I saw something moving. It was an arm, a hairy arm, covered in dark, coarse hair. I froze, my blood turning cold in an instant. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed, but my body refused to respond. That wasn't a raccoon or a coyote or any animal. That was a man's arm. My heart raced so fast I thought I might pass out. I was paralyzed, my entire body frozen with fear. My mind raced to comprehend what was happening. Why was there a man under my bed? How long had he been there? And what the hell was he planning to do? The thoughts came too fast. My legs felt weak. I was too terrified to move. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I knew I had to run, but all I could think about was that man's arm. The thought of standing up and running to the door sent a wave of nausea through me. What if he grabbed me the second I moved? What if he lunged at my ankles? I don't know how long I laid there, my mind paralyzed with fear, but eventually my instincts kicked in. My body surged with adrenaline. I had to get out of there. I had to run. I threw myself out of bed, scrambling to my feet. As I did, I heard a noise from beneath the bed, a shuffling sound, a low grunt. It was too much. I wasn't going to wait to find out what it meant. I ran for the door. I don't know how I managed to make it that far, but I was suddenly at the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. I threw it open, slamming it against the wall, and bolted for the stairs. I had no plan, no thought other than to get to my parents' room. I was screaming in my head, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. It was as if fear had stolen my voice, and all I could do was run. But before I reached the stairs, I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder, spinning me around. A hand covered my mouth. I gasped, my eyes wide in shock. My pulse was still racing, and my thoughts were scrambled. Who was this? Why were they doing this? Should be quiet, a voice whispered urgently in my ear. That voice. I knew it. It was a guy I'd gone on a few dates with. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was him. I had no idea how he'd gotten in, but there he was, standing in the dark hallway, holding me. His grip was tight, but not enough to hurt. I didn't mean to scare you, he said, his voice trembling. I just wanted to know what you were like when you're alone, to see what you're like when I don't know, when you're by yourself. I felt my stomach turn. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The words were incomprehensible. He had been under my bed, watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I wanted to scream, to yell for my parents, but still, no sound came out. I was shaking with the force of it all. I pushed against him, trying to break free, but his grip didn't loosen. Please, just let me go, I begged, my voice barely a whisper. His face twisted, a strange mix of guilt and confusion. He seemed to think this was all some mistake, a misunderstanding. I didn't mean it. I just wanted to apologize. I swear, I didn't want to make you scared. I shoved him harder, but he didn't move. Get out of my house, I finally managed to say, my voice barely audible. Leave. Right now. He didn't leave immediately. For a moment he stood there, his eyes flickering with indecision. Then he said something I could never forget. Can you give me a ride home? I stared at him in disbelief, too shocked to respond at first. Then it clicked. He was asking for a ride after breaking into my house, hiding under my bed, and terrorizing me in my own bedroom. He had no idea how deeply he had crossed a line. No, I said, my voice finally finding strength. Get out. Don't ever talk to me again. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't know if I could trust myself to make the call. The shock, the terror, it left me frozen in place. After a few moments of silence, he turned slowly and walked away, disappearing into the night. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling in the doorway. My whole body felt like it had been violated in a way that I couldn't explain. I don't remember going back to my room. I don't remember if I cried or if I sat there for hours. I just know that the next morning, everything felt different. My parents never woke up during any of it. I told them what happened, and they seemed concerned, but they also told me that he was just a nice boy who made a bad decision. But I knew better. The man who had been under my bed, who had watched me sleep, wasn't just someone who made a bad decision. He was someone who violated every boundary I had ever known. And the worst part was that it wasn't until much later that I realized how lucky I was that nothing worse happened that night. I never spoke to him again. He tried a few times, but I shut him out completely. I should have called the cops. I know that now. I should have done something more than just tell him to leave. But that night, I was too scared, too rattled, and too shaken by what had happened. I was a third-year medical student, still relatively fresh in the grand scheme of things. but with enough clinical experience to feel somewhat competent on the labor and delivery floor. My OB/GYN rotation was nearing its end, and I had been spending most of my days in the hospital, working alongside residents and attendings, getting used to the rhythms of delivery, watching as babies were brought into the world, learning more than I could have ever imagined. One day, I was assigned to the maternity ward, where a woman was brought in with mild contractions. She and her husband looked like a typical couple, a little nervous but mostly calm, as they were wheeled into the labor and delivery room. The husband, his face a mix of excitement and concern, sat by her side as we went through the usual assessments. I asked them the standard questions. How long had the contractions been going on? How frequently were they? Any complications with prior pregnancies? And then I asked one question that always seemed to break the tension a bit. What are you going to name the baby? The woman smiled softly. Astra, she said. Astra. I found the name intriguing, different. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it. The husband nodded in agreement, a small but proud smile spreading across his face. I thought it was an interesting coincidence, considering the dream I had the night before. In that dream, I was delivering a baby, and its name was Sunny. I remembered that the name seemed to have such a vivid connection to the light, almost as if it embodied the brightness of the sun and star. It felt so close, and yet I couldn't understand why. But I didn't think too much about it at the time. It was just a fleeting thought. I made a mental note of the name and shifted my focus back to the task at hand. The contractions were mild at the moment, but it wasn't long before the room was buzzing with activity. The attending physician, the patient's primary OB/GYN, was on his way. He was a bit late, but it was nothing too out of the ordinary. We were still a bit away from the actual delivery. The patient's progress started picking up, and soon, it became clear that she was ready to push. The resident and I began to prepare for the delivery. We suited up, gloved up, and got into position, waiting for the attending physician to arrive. The mood in the room shifted slightly, from calm anticipation to something more tense, as the moment of delivery was upon us. The pressure was palpable. Just as the patient began to push, the attending physician arrived, rushing into the room. He was out of breath, his face a little flushed. He muttered something about how it had taken him longer than expected to bike into the hospital that day, as he hurriedly suited up, getting into position. He made his way to the front of the delivery table, positioning himself to catch the baby once it was fully delivered. The resident and I exchanged a glance. It wasn't that we were worried about the delivery itself. It was a routine procedure, but something was off. I noticed it before the resident did. There were small, black, fly-like insects crawling on the attending's head, right around the occipital area of his scalp. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw them more clearly. They were crawling all over his hair, moving slowly, almost deliberately. I could feel my stomach churn slightly. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't exactly explain why. The resident, who was just as startled as I was, spoke up in a shaky voice. "Doc, you've got some bugs on your head," she said, pointing at the insects. The attending physician didn't seem to notice at first, but when he did, he gave a small chuckle. "Oh yeah," he said nonchalantly. "I biked through a whole swarm of them on the way here. Didn't think it'd be this bad." He didn't seem bothered by it. He didn't flinch or try to brush them away immediately. Instead, he just continued preparing for the birth, moving his hands to take his place, ready to catch the baby. But the resident and I couldn't take our eyes off the bugs. There was something unsettling about it, the way they crawled so freely on his head, like it was a normal, everyday occurrence. I thought it was strange, but at that moment, I was distracted by the imminent birth. Then, without warning, the baby came out. The moment the baby emerged, we all froze for a beat. I could tell immediately that something wasn't right. The baby's head had an obvious cranial deformity. The skull was malformed in a way I'd never seen before. There was a noticeable depression in the flat area right at the top, almost as though something had been pressing against it for too long, causing it to cave in. The baby's head was also much smaller than it should have been. I could feel the air shift in the room. The silence was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. It was the kind of silence that makes your chest tighten, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, and the kind where everyone in the room knows that something is terribly wrong, but no one says a word. The mother, still breathing heavily from the effort of pushing, looked up anxiously, her eyes searching us for answers. Her voice was small, barely above a whisper, but the fear was clear. "Is everything okay? Is my baby all right?" she asked. It wasn't just the cranial deformity that was troubling. The baby's skin also had an unusual pallor, and a large, dark red birthmark marked the right side of her face, just beneath the eye. It was an ominous sign. I had seen birthmarks before, but this one was different, darker, larger, more pronounced than usual. The weight of the diagnosis hit me all at once, and I could feel the dread pooling in my stomach. We moved quickly, doing what we had to do. The attending physician, who had seemingly been oblivious to the situation up until then, quickly stepped in, trying to maintain composure. He examined the baby and, without a word, ordered an immediate referral to neonatology. The baby was whisked away, placed in an incubator, and brought down to the NICU for further evaluation. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with unspoken tension. The attending physician didn't say much. He rarely did when something was wrong. The resident and I exchanged looks, but neither of us dared to speak. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something had gone terribly wrong. And the bizarre connection between the dream I'd had the night before, the name of the baby, and the insects crawling on the attending's head seemed too strange to ignore. Later, we received the diagnosis. The baby had Sturge-Weber syndrome, a rare neurological condition that causes a variety of developmental issues, including seizures, mental impairment, and other health problems. It was a devastating diagnosis, especially for first-time parents, and it left me feeling hollow, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. The mother and father were devastated, but they held on to each other, trying to find strength in the face of what they'd been told. I couldn't stop thinking about that day, about the bugs, about the dream, and about the name Astra. The coincidence was just too much to ignore. It gnawed at me for days, leaving me unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that I had witnessed something far more significant than I had initially understood. As the days passed, I continued my work, trying to focus on my studies, but every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but think back to that moment. The bugs on the doctor's head, the deformity on the baby's skull, the birthmark, and the diagnosis. It felt like the universe had somehow whispered a warning to me, and I had failed to fully comprehend it in time. I never really understood the connection between the dream and what happened, nor the strange events that transpired during that delivery. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything that happened that day was somehow linked, that the name Astra, the bugs, and the cranial deformity weren't just coincidences, but part of some larger, darker puzzle that I had barely begun to understand. And in the silence that followed the delivery, as the mother's tears mixed with the sterile smell of the hospital room, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something bigger at play, something beyond the realm of what I could see and touch, that would forever haunt me as I continued my journey as a doctor. I grew up on a farm that was connected to a game preserve, a sprawling stretch of wilderness that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't a big farm, just enough land for our house, a barn, and a few scattered fields for hay and crops. The rest was just wild, dense woods, with tall trees and thick underbrush. My brothers and I practically lived out there, running wild in the woods whenever we could. We'd spend hours outside, climbing trees, chasing rabbits, and exploring the game trails that crisscrossed the land. As far back as I can remember, the woods had a strange pull on me. There was always something about them, something a little unsettling. It wasn't that they were dangerous. It was something different, something hard to put into words. It was as though the woods themselves knew something that we didn't. When I was a kid, I used to be afraid of the dark in those woods, but not in the way most kids are. I wasn't scared of monsters or creatures that went bump in the night. I was afraid of the silence. It would always come at night, like a blanket that smothered the woods, and when the silence hit, it was deep. You could almost hear the forest itself holding its breath, waiting for something. Most nights, it wasn't like that, but on the nights when it was, that's when I felt it, the feeling that something was watching, waiting from deep in the trees. It was always at night, and sometimes it was just a feeling, something that made me turn and run when I couldn't see anything, when nothing seemed out of place. It was just wrong. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My brothers, too, had their moments, but we never talked about it. Maybe it was because we didn't have to. We just knew that there were certain places we didn't go, certain things we didn't talk about. As I got older, I stopped feeling scared so often. But there were still those nights, those moments when I'd be out near the woods, walking to the outhouse or playing with the dogs, and I'd feel that same unease. It would creep in like a shadow, moving through the trees, but I'd tell myself it was just my imagination. I had to. I had to tell myself that, because there wasn't anything else to say. By the time I was 14 or 15, I had gotten used to the woods. I'd been in them so many times that they were almost like a second home to me. But that day was different. It was spring, and the sun was shining bright, the kind of warm afternoon where everything felt alive and vibrant. I had decided to go gather some plants for a terrarium. It wasn't a long walk, just a few minutes down the dirt lane that led out from our house. The lane was still on our property, just barely touching the edge of the game preserve, but it felt like a world of difference. I'd walked this path hundreds of times, often with the dogs by my side, so it was nothing special. I knew these woods better than anyone. As I walked, I kept my eyes open for any interesting plants. The trees were just starting to bud, and the air was full of the scent of fresh grass and wet earth. But there was something strange about that afternoon. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed how quiet it had become. I mean, there were no birds singing, no squirrels running across the branches, no rustling in the underbrush. It was like someone had turned off the noise of the forest, and for a second, I felt a little uneasy. But I shrugged it off. It was spring, after all. Maybe the birds were just being quiet, or maybe the animals were still hiding from the warmth of the day. Still, it felt wrong. It felt off. I kept walking, looking for the plants I needed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That's when I heard it, a tapping noise. Soft at first, like a faint rhythm coming from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker, one of the many that lived around our property. They were always hammering away at the trees, sometimes for hours, and I figured that's all it was. I didn't think much of it, but then the tapping grew louder. It was rhythmic, like someone was drumming, but the beats were irregular, like a person slapping their thighs in a pattern. The sound seemed to move with me, getting louder as I moved through the woods. I paused for a second, listening carefully. It was coming from farther up the bank, where the woods grew thicker. The tapping stopped when I stopped, and when I took another step, it started again. It was strange. A woodpecker doesn't do that, does it? And if it was a woodpecker, why was it so silent when I wasn't moving? I took another step, trying to see what it was. The tapping grew louder, but I still couldn't see anything. It was like the sound was deliberately keeping itself out of sight. I moved a little farther, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. I was getting irritated now, more curious than anything. The tapping was so close that I should have seen the bird by now, but there was nothing. It was just the sound, like someone had timed it perfectly to match my every move. I started to get that uneasy feeling again, the one I hadn't felt in a long time. I took another step, this time rustling the leaves beneath my feet, hoping to startle whatever it was into revealing itself. And that's when it happened. The tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then, after a second of absolute stillness, the noise started again, but now it wasn't a rhythmic tapping. It was closer, more urgent, and it sounded wrong. It didn't sound like any woodpecker anymore. It was like someone slapping their thighs, but with a steady, deliberate beat, like something human. It was like a person, but I couldn't see anyone. The noise came closer, step by step, and I realized then that it wasn't just a coincidence. It was following me. It was getting closer every time I moved. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart started to race, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. I don't know why I was so sure, but in that moment I knew, whatever it wasn't good. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a game animal. It was something else, something that knew I was there and was deliberately getting closer. I started to move, slowly at first, trying to get a sense of where the sound was coming from. My legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in the mud, but I forced myself to keep walking. The noise kept coming closer. It was almost on top of me now, and I could feel the dread rising in my chest. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I had to know what it was. I twisted around, trying to peer into the thick trees behind me. There was nothing. No one. Not a single thing was there. But the sound kept coming. It was so close now, I could almost feel it on my skin. My stomach dropped. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the woods, stumbling over rocks and roots, barely able to breathe from the panic that had taken over me. The sound followed, matching my pace, but I couldn't make myself stop. I didn't care what it was. I just had to get away from it. I was about to crash into the 6-foot bank that led back to the dirt road when I made a split-second decision. Without thinking, I launched myself off the edge of the bank, rolling down the slope and landing hard on the road below. I didn't care about the pain. I didn't care about anything except getting out of those woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I don't know why, but I felt like the woods wouldn't follow me there. Something in my gut told me that the road was a boundary, a place where whatever it was couldn't cross. It stayed just out of sight for a moment, but I could feel it, moving along the tree line. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it watching me from the shadows. I kept running, my heart pounding, until I came into view of the house. I didn't stop until I was standing in the front yard. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just stood there, trying to catch my breath, my body shaking from the adrenaline. For years, I never told anyone what happened. I felt ridiculous, like I had imagined it all. But that feeling, the dread, the certainty that something had been following me, something bad, never left. It stayed with me, buried deep in my gut, gnawing at me every time I passed the woods. One night, when I was older, I finally told my mom and my little brother. My brother just looked at me, his face serious, and said, "Why do you think I stopped going back there?" It followed me once from the other side of the road. And in that moment, I felt all the weight of what had happened. The fear, the dread, it all came flooding back. It wasn't just me. Whatever it was, it had followed my brother too. It wasn't something I'd imagined. It was real. And that thought, that realization, made my stomach churn all over again. That's when I knew. Something in those woods, something that couldn't be explained, couldn't be reasoned with, was out there. Something that made every instinct in my body scream to stay away. And for the first time in my life, I understood why the woods had always felt wrong. Because deep down, we all knew there was something bad in those trees. Something that had been there long before we ever set foot on the land. And something that was waiting for the next person to wander too far. In our culture, when someone dies violently, we burn their clothes. It doesn't matter how important those clothes are or how expensive. It doesn't matter if the person was loved or hated. If blood stains them in death, they go into the fire. That's just how it is. It's something we don't break, because we know what happens if we do. My uncle broke a lot of rules when he was alive, and even in death, he found a way to keep ruining things for the rest of us. He died 2 winters ago. That year, the snow came early and hard. My uncle had always been a problem. He was one of those men who you didn't want around your sisters, your kids, or even your pets. He drank too much, lied more than he breathed, and had a sick way about him. Everyone knew what he was, but nothing ever stuck to him. He was good at playing the fool, pretending he was just troubled or down on his luck. But we all knew better. I was in college when I got the call. He had gotten into some sort of fight or argument at a bar 2 towns over. Details were murky, but what we heard was that he got dragged by a car down a gravel road. Not a short way either. They found his body in a ditch, limbs twisted, coat shredded, face nearly unrecognizable. No one came forward. No one claimed the act. The cops chalked it up to a hit and run and moved on. I don't think they tried too hard. My mom and my aunt, his wife, were the ones who had to go to the coroner's office. I didn't go with them. I didn't want to see his body. I never liked him when he was alive, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just because he was dead. They didn't have a choice, though. Someone had to claim what was left. When they got back, they told us something strange. The coroner handed them a clear bag with his personal effects, wallet, belt, shoes, and the clothes he died in, still stiff with blood and road grit. He told them that if they didn't want them, they could authorize the office to dispose of them, but my mother took them. She said she didn't want to leave anything behind. Later that night, she told me that when they picked up the bag, someone from the office said something odd. A warning. He said they probably shouldn't open the bag, that it would be better to burn everything without looking. My uncle himself had supposedly told the staff not to let his sister or wife see what was inside. That made no sense. How could he have said that? He was dead when they found him. Maybe it was a joke or a mistake. That's what we told ourselves. They didn't listen. Curiosity does what it does. That night, they took the bag downstairs to the basement, where the old wood stove was still connected. I followed them halfway down the stairs. My mom told me to stay outside the room. I didn't argue. I just sat on the bottom step and listened to them unzip the bag. I didn't hear much. Just the rustling of the plastic, a sharp intake of breath, then nothing for a while. It was cold down there. My breath steamed in front of my face, even though we had the furnace on upstairs. I wrapped my coat tighter and tried not to think about what they were seeing. Then there was a crash from upstairs. It wasn't subtle. It was sharp and loud, like a bunch of glasses shattering. We all jumped. My mother and aunt came rushing out of the basement. I was already halfway up the stairs, my heart slamming in my chest. We got to the kitchen and found the cabinet above the sink open and several drinking glasses smashed across the floor. No one else was in the house. The door was still locked. No windows were open. We all just stood there staring for a few seconds. My aunt looked pale. My mom muttered something under her breath and started sweeping up the mess. They didn't say much about it after that. They told each other it must have been the shelf giving out or something slipping loose. But I'd seen that cabinet 100 times. Nothing had ever fallen from it before. The next day was the start of the wake. In our tradition, someone always stays with the body. No one should be left alone, not even the dead. My uncle was in a closed casket at the funeral home. His face wasn't really fit for viewing. The family took shifts. I stayed with him from 10 until 3 in the morning. Then a family friend came to relieve me. Her name was Gita. She had known my mom and aunt since they were kids. A hard woman, skeptical of everything. She didn't believe in curses or spirits. She just wanted to help. That morning, when we came back to take our next shift, she looked shaken. She pulled my mom aside, and I saw her whisper something. Later, my mother told me that Gita had driven past the spot where the accident happened, the ditch where they found my uncle. She swore she saw a man standing by the road. Said he looked like my uncle, down to the coat and the way he stood. But his face was wrong. He was smiling, too wide, too still. She said it didn't look human. She said he watched her the whole time as she drove by, not moving, not blinking. That was the last shift she ever took. She didn't come back. The next morning, the last day of the wake, my uncle, my mom's younger brother, not the dead one, was already at the funeral home when we arrived. He had the grave look of someone who hadn't slept all night. He told us quietly that something had happened, that at around 4 in the morning, he heard footsteps outside his house, crunching snow, slow, deliberate. He lived just a few miles from the site of the accident. It was pitch black outside, no lights around. He thought maybe it was an animal, but when he looked out the window, there was a figure walking past his yard. He went outside with his shotgun. He called out. No answer, but the footsteps stopped. He circled the house. Nothing. Not even prints in the snow when he checked later. When he got to the funeral home that morning, he pulled my mom and Ann aside. He asked them straight up what they had done. That's when they told us the truth. They hadn't burned the clothes right away. They'd looked at them, touched them. My aunt said she even tried to wash the blood out of the shirt, as if that would fix something. My mother said she held the jacket, the one he always wore. Said it still smelled like him, and she just wanted to remember. That night, after Gita told them what she saw, and my uncle heard the footsteps, they knew they had to do it. They went back down to the basement, dumped everything into the wood stove, and lit it up. The smell was unbearable, they said. Burning fabric and blood, and something else. Something oily and rancid. They didn't stop until it was ash. We buried him the next day. The funeral was short. No one cried much. The cold was biting, the sky gray and low, but there was a sense of finality to it, like we had closed a door. I remember looking around and seeing the faces of my family. My aunt looked tired but relieved. My mother looked the same. There was no sign of him anymore. No smashed glasses. No strange smiles. No footprints in the snow. After the funeral, we all went back to my mother's house. It felt warmer somehow, quieter, like whatever had been hanging over us was gone. We ate in silence for a while, then people started talking again, laughing even. The tension that had built over the past week slowly faded. That night, I stayed in the guest room. I kept the lamp on, just in case, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no knocks, just the wind outside and the creak of the old radiator. I fell asleep around midnight and didn't wake until morning. We don't talk about my uncle much anymore, not the one who died. The rest of us still visit and check in on each other. We keep closer now, and we remember the old ways. We don't question them anymore. We don't get curious. We burn the clothes, and we never, ever look. It was 23 years ago when I found myself in Haiti with a few of my cousins. We had traveled to the countryside for a visit, and the place was so remote that the darkness of the night felt almost suffocating. When I say it was dark, I mean it was pitch black. There were no streetlights, no neon signs, no artificial light to make the night feel even remotely like it wasn't a void. The only thing we had was the weak glow of the moon, peeking out from behind thick clouds, and the occasional flicker of stars in the sky. We had been out there for hours, just running around and playing a game of hide and seek, or at least that's what we called it. The hill we were running up and down on was steep, rocky, and treacherous, covered with uneven boulders. It wasn't the safest terrain for kids to be sprinting through, but we didn't care. The adrenaline from running around in the night made it feel like an adventure. The air was cool, and the scent of the earth seemed to rise up with every step, mixing with the faint smell of something I couldn't quite place. It was an eerie kind of stillness in the air, but we were too busy laughing and shouting to pay much attention to it. Our families had warned us to be careful out here, but when you're young, you don't listen to such things. You think you're invincible. At one point during the game, I had climbed halfway up the hill, trying to get a better vantage point of where my cousins were hiding. My heart was racing as I caught sight of one of them ducking behind a rock, trying to make themselves invisible. I was about to charge down the hill when something stopped me dead in my tracks. Out of nowhere, an old man appeared. I'm telling you, he just materialized from the darkness, like he had been there the whole time. I could barely make out his features at first, but I saw his silhouette, bent over slightly as if he were struggling to stand up straight. His hair was wild, almost as if he hadn't combed it in years. His clothes were old, threadbare, and faded, almost blending into the night itself. But what stood out the most were his legs. I froze. The old man shuffled closer to us, and in the dead silence of the night, his voice cracked the air. He asked, "Hey boys, you know where I can get some horseshoes?" My cousins and I looked at each other, confused, not sure if he was talking to us or if he had even seen us. The question was so out of place, so random, and so strange that none of us could respond immediately. We were too stunned. I could barely make out his face in the shadows, but there was something wrong with his expression. It looked like he was in pain, struggling to speak, but what really got to me was his legs. He had legs like a horse's. No, scratch that, they were horse legs. They were covered in hair, and the shape of his legs, the way they moved, it wasn't human. I couldn't fully comprehend it, but it was like watching something that didn't belong in the world of humans. His feet were huge, and the way he shifted his weight, the clop of his hooves against the dirt, it sounded exactly like a horse walking on a dirt path. It didn't make sense. Before any of us could say anything, the old man made the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. It wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered before. He made a sound like a horse neighing, loud and distorted, almost like he was trying to speak, but could only produce animal noises. His chest heaved as he took in sharp breaths, and all I could do was stare. The sound echoed around us, filling the dark valley in the night. I don't know what came over us, but in that moment, fear flooded every inch of my body. My mind screamed to run, to get away from whatever this was. My cousins and I didn't need to exchange words. We just turned and bolted, running down the hill as fast as our legs could carry us. We didn't look back. We ran through the darkness, not daring to slow down or even catch our breath. The sound of his hooves faded into the background, but I couldn't shake the image of those legs, of the way he had stood there, just waiting for us to notice him. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our family's home. None of us spoke about it that night, but I could see the fear in my cousin's eyes. We had all experienced something together that didn't make sense, something that should never have happened. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now, but I know what we saw. The next day, the old man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. We asked around, but no one knew who he was, where he had come from, or why he had been there. It was like he had never existed. But we knew better. Whatever it was that had come to us that night, it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. A few months later, I found myself back in Haiti with my family for another visit. This time, things took a darker turn. One of my cousins, a guy we had all grown up with, suddenly became very ill. He was in his 20s, and it came on fast. 1 minute he was fine, and the next he was bedridden, unable to even speak. We didn't know what was wrong with him, and neither did the doctors. Within a few days, he had passed away. In Haiti, when someone dies, it's customary for the immediate family to stay at the house of the deceased for a while. That night, we were all at my uncle's place. gathering together to mourn and support each other. It was a somber occasion, and the house felt heavy with grief. The room was filled with quiet voices, and the smell of incense hung in the air, mixing with the scent of old wood and dust. We had just finished the burial that afternoon, and the mood was solemn. But as the night went on, something strange began to happen. Around midnight, we heard a loud banging on the door. It was sudden and forceful, like someone was trying to break in. At first, we all froze, unsure of what was happening. Then we heard a voice from outside, muffled but unmistakable. "Mom, let me in. Help, help." I don't think any of us moved at first. We were all in shock, staring at each other, trying to make sense of what we had just heard. The voice sounded like our cousin, the one who had just been buried hours ago. Panic set in. The banging on the door grew louder, more desperate. It wasn't just one voice anymore. We could hear other voices, two deep, harsh voices. They were shouting, "Get him! Bring him back!" The sound of footsteps followed, as though men were beating our cousin, dragging him away. The entire situation felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But it was real. Too real. I didn't know what to think. My mind was racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Were we hallucinating? But the urgency in the voices, the pounding on the door, it felt like something far worse was happening. Then my uncle, the man whose house we were in, started to panic. He grabbed a machete and began shouting for everyone to stay back, to stay calm. He told us that this wasn't something to ignore. As crazy as it sounds, there's a known practice in some parts of Haiti called zombie. It's a form of voodoo, and people have been known to be poisoned, buried alive, and later dug up to become slaves for those who practice it. The idea is to make someone appear dead, only for them to wake up in the grave, weak and disoriented, only to be forced into servitude. There are rumors that some people get rich off this practice, and they're not afraid to kill anyone who tries to stop them. The voices outside weren't just calling for help. They were making sure that no one would intervene. Whoever was outside wanted to take our cousin, to bring him back to the people who would use him. If we tried to stop them, they would kill us all. The fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. We didn't know who was on the other side of the door. Were they just pretending to be our cousin? Were they really trying to take him away? We could only imagine what horrors they would inflict on him. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night. The pounding stopped after a while, and the voices faded away. But the damage was done. The fear we had felt in that moment lingered. It stayed with us long after that night ended, long after we thought we were safe. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who was behind that door, or what they had wanted. But I'll never forget the terror in the voices, the way they echoed in the dark. And I'll never forget the feeling that whatever was going on, it wasn't over yet. To this day, every time I hear a strange noise in the night, I remember that night. I remember the sound of my cousin's voice, the desperate cries for help. And I remember the fear that gripped us all. We were lucky that night, but I don't think we'll ever truly know if we were the ones who escaped, or if we were just spared for now. I like to spend my weekends biking out in the countryside. There's this little town in Michigan I've been drawn to over the years called Three Oaks. It's got that quiet old American town feel, brick storefronts, a train track cutting through, a tiny downtown where people still wave when you pass. Not many cars. No stress. That Saturday, my wife had a shift at work, and I had nothing planned, so I decided to head out there again, just to enjoy the peace of it. It was summer, early June. Not too hot yet, and the sky was this uninterrupted sheet of pale blue. I loaded my bike onto the back of the car and drove the hour and changed to Three Oaks. I parked on one of the streets that branch off downtown, near a little antique store with a crooked American flag hanging out front. I got my gear together, filled my water bottle, and rode off. The nice thing about biking around Three Oaks is how fast it gets rural. You leave downtown, pass maybe a dozen houses, and then suddenly you're surrounded by cornfields, broken down barns, and tree clusters that look like they've been there for centuries. No sidewalks, just narrow roads, some gravel, some cracked asphalt, cutting through farmland. There are long stretches where you don't see a house for half a mile or more. I didn't plan a route. I rarely do. I just follow what looks interesting. Sometimes I go off my maps entirely. I like to get a little lost. That's kind of the point, disappear for a while. I was probably 30 or 40 minutes into my ride, pedaling down a road with no name, just one of those gravel lanes with weeds growing up the middle, when I saw a minivan come up behind me. It was silver, a little older, with dark-tinted windows. It passed me slowly, nothing unusual, and I gave the driver a casual glance as it went by. Then, about 100 feet ahead, it pulled over to the side and stopped. I slowed a bit, coasting toward it. The passenger window rolled down. Inside were two people, a man and a woman, mid to late 20s, maybe 30 at most. The man leaned across the woman to look at me. He had a thin goatee, short-cropped hair mostly hidden under a baseball cap, and a big, toothy grin. His eyes were squinting against the sun, and he looked like he was about to tell a joke. The woman didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a neutral expression. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had sunglasses on. They asked me if I knew someone. A name, David Christ. I thought for a second, but came up empty. I didn't know anyone by that name, not even someone who knew someone with that name. So I shook my head and said no. The guy looked disappointed for a split second. Then the smile came back. The van sat there for a moment after I pedaled off, then turned around and drove off the way it had come. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People get turned around in the country all the time, especially if they're not from the area. Maybe they were visiting and trying to find someone they hadn't seen in years. Maybe it was the wrong name. Maybe they'd already asked a bunch of locals, and I was just the next person who looked like they might help. I turned down another road, pedaled through a patch of shade where the trees grew over the gravel like a green tunnel, then came out on another straightaway running between cornfields on the left and empty pasture on the right. After a while, I noticed the van again, this time coming from the opposite direction. We passed each other, and I gave a quick nod. The driver smiled again, a little wider this time, like he recognized me. That was when something in my gut started to itch. It wasn't anything dramatic yet. It could have just been another coincidence. There aren't many roads out there, and maybe they'd circled back or gotten lost. But the smile stuck with me. It was too familiar, too knowing, not the kind of smile you give a stranger. I kept going, but I started paying more attention to where I was. I looked back every once in a while. No van behind me, not right away. I kept changing directions, making lefts and rights based on the way the sun hit the roads or how inviting a tree-covered path looked. But then I saw the van again. This time, we were going in the same direction. They were behind me. I pulled over, figuring maybe they wanted to ask something else. Maybe they realized their mistake and wanted to apologize or explain. But they didn't pull up beside me right away. They slowed to a crawl and stopped about 10 feet away. The driver leaned out the window again. The woman didn't move. I stayed on my bike, one foot on the ground. He didn't smile this time. He just looked at me, and he didn't say anything. I waited. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Still nothing. His face didn't change. It was like he was studying me, not in a curious way, in a clinical, quiet kind of way. Like he was looking for something, measuring something. Finally, he said it again. "Do you know David Christ?" I didn't answer. I just stared at him. I think I shook my head slowly, but I'm not even sure. I pedaled away after that. And that was when things really started to feel wrong. Not just uncomfortable, dangerous. I looked around as I rode. No houses, no parked cars, no signs of life. Just open fields, a few patches of woods, and one long empty road. It hit me that if anything happened, if I got hit, if I crashed, if someone decided to hurt me, it would be hours before someone came by. And I was far from the town center. I decided to head back. I picked up the pace, heart thumping a little faster, and stayed alert for the sound of an engine. I came to a bend where the road forked, a right curve continuing the gravel lane, and a sharp left that turned into what looked more like a farm track. Dirt, uneven, maybe not even on most maps. As I neared the fork, the van came around the bend ahead, right in front of me. They must have looped around. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't close enough to see their faces, but I knew it was them. The van slowed as it approached. I reached into the small zippered pouch under my seat, where I kept a pocket knife. It wasn't much, just a little fold-out blade, but it was something. Still, I knew that if they were serious, if they wanted to run me down or drag me into the van, a knife wouldn't do much. The road was narrow, and I didn't have room to maneuver. At the last second, I took the right fork. The van slowed, then stopped at the intersection. I didn't look back. I just pedaled as fast as I could. Gravel crunched beneath my tires. My calves burned. I didn't know if they were following. The road twisted, so I couldn't see far behind me. Finally, I found a gap in the cornfield and pulled off. I crouched down just inside, hidden by the tall stalks, and waited. A minute passed, then another. The van never came. I crept back to the road and looked. In the distance, I saw it heading the opposite direction, slowly disappearing. I waited until it was gone. Then I doubled back and took the dirt path. It was rough, full of dips and rocks, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that van. The path eventually connected with another gravel road, which led me toward a cluster of barns and finally back into the outskirts of Three Oaks. I didn't stop until I was back in town, where the streets were paved and people walked dogs and lawn sprinklers hissed on neatly trimmed grass. I sat on a bench near my car and let myself calm down. Later that evening, I kept thinking about the name, David Christ. It echoed in my head. Why that name? Why did he keep asking me that? Was it a prank? Was he trying to mess with me? I looked it up when I got home. It stuck in my head more than it should have, and I wanted to know why. The first few results were random, Facebook profiles, nothing suspicious. I tried spelling it different ways. Eventually, I found something that made me stop cold. There was a news article out of Knoxville, Tennessee, from a couple years back. It said a man named David Christ had turned himself in after stabbing another man at a gas station. The details were vague, but there was a photo. Same face, same grin, just a bit younger. No hat, no goatee, but it was him. The same man who had pulled up beside me 3 different times in one afternoon and stared at me like he knew me. I kept reading. The article said he'd been charged, but didn't mention if he was convicted. I searched court records, inmate databases, even news updates. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished. No follow-up stories. No sentencing. No prison record. Just a ghost trail. The next day, I called the local police department in Three Oaks, not to report a crime, just to ask if anyone else had seen that van. I described it. The officer I spoke to hadn't heard anything. He said people from out of town come up all the time. They drive around. They get lost. I didn't push it. I haven't been back to Three Oaks since then. Not by bike. Not alone. I still ride, but I stay closer to home now. I stick to areas with traffic, with cell signal, with people. I don't know what the man in that van wanted. I don't know why he kept asking about David Christ when he was David Christ. Maybe he was playing a game. Maybe he wanted to see who would recognize him. Maybe he was trying to see who would lie, or who would admit the truth. Or maybe he wanted to be remembered. But I do know this. I didn't know David Christ when I started that ride. I do now. It was supposed to be a spontaneous, relaxing road trip. My boyfriend, our 2 dogs, and I had decided to head up to the Northern California redwoods. The idea was simple. Just hit the road with no real plans. I'd been up to this area when I was younger, and I remembered it being beautiful, full of towering trees and thick, mysterious woods. I didn't know exactly where we were going, but that was part of the fun. The sense of adventure, the open road, and the freedom from plans. It felt perfect. A few nights into our trip, we found ourselves in a small town. It was late, and we hadn't yet figured out our next move. We'd been driving around for hours, stopping here and there, exploring a few places, taking pictures. But now we were tired, and the idea of finding a motel or a camping spot in the middle of nowhere didn't seem appealing. We were about to start looking for somewhere to settle down for the night when we met someone who changed our plans. Her name was Amy. She was a friend of a friend, and we bumped into her at a small local bar. After a few drinks and casual conversation, she offered to let us crash at her place for the night. She lived in a charming, old Victorian house that looked like something out of a picture book. Her roommates weren't home, just her and another female roommate, so there was plenty of space for us. We accepted the offer without hesitation. It was the perfect solution. It would save us the hassle of finding a place to stay, and we could have a roof over our heads instead of camping out in the woods. Amy's house was everything you'd expect from a Victorian. Creaky floors, tall ceilings, a winding staircase, and big bay windows that overlooked the yard. It had an air of mystery, a history that made the house feel alive in its own way. We were shown to a sitting room just off the front door, a cozy space with a fireplace and large windows that let in the cool night air. It seemed like a peaceful, quiet place to sleep. Our dogs were happy to curl up on the futon with us, and we both sank into the soft cushions, feeling the weight of the day finally ease off our shoulders. The house was quiet when we fell asleep, the kind of stillness that comes only in places far from the city. We were deep into sleep when we were suddenly jolted awake by the loud sound of a doorbell ringing. It was a deep, persistent chime that echoed through the house. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard footsteps. Someone was moving downstairs. I lay there for a moment, unsure if I should get up. Then I heard the door creak open. I listened as the roommate checked the door, and then heard her footsteps as she went back upstairs. The door closed, and silence returned. My boyfriend mumbled something in his sleep, and I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that settled in. I told myself it was probably nothing, just some late-night visitor. But then it happened again. The doorbell rang once more, just as loudly as before. This time, I could hear the roommate's footsteps again, going down the stairs, then the sound of the door opening and closing. She came into our room and asked if we'd heard it too. She seemed unsettled, and I could tell she was trying to make sense of it. We all agreed it was probably a malfunction, that maybe the bell was just old and glitchy. She said she was going to lock the door and go back to bed. I didn't feel completely at ease, but I tried to ignore the unease and drifted back to sleep. Not long after, I woke up again, this time to a low growl coming from one of the dogs. It was deep and throaty, the kind of growl I had never heard from him before. He was normally so friendly and playful, especially around strangers. I glanced at him, and he was staring intently at the window, his body tense. I thought it was strange, but didn't want to wake my boyfriend over something that seemed like just an odd noise. I whispered for him to be quiet, hoping he would settle back down. The growling continued for a moment longer before he fell silent. I was just starting to drift back to sleep when I heard my boyfriend suddenly jerk out of bed. He was up and moving quickly, slamming his hand against the window. I jumped up in a panic, my heart racing. There, outside the bay window, just a few feet away from where we lay, was a man's face. He was staring at us, his eyes wide and unblinking. My boyfriend immediately reached for the axe we kept nearby. Just in case, we'd been camping, and it was close at hand, and bolted out the door. I could hear him yelling at the man as he chased him down the street. I froze in place, too scared to move. The whole thing felt unreal. I could still see the man's face in my mind, his cold, emotionless expression staring back at me through the glass. I kept thinking that he had been watching us, waiting, maybe even plotting. I didn't understand why he had been so close, why he'd been so bold. Why had he just stood there? The commotion woke up the roommates, and they came rushing down. Everyone was on edge, and it took a while before we all calmed down. The adrenaline kept us up for the rest of the night. We stayed alert, listening to every sound, fearing that the man might come back or that something else would happen. My mind kept replaying the moment when I saw him staring in at us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was off. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I couldn't help but think about what had happened. I tried to rationalize it. The man could have been a random passerby. Maybe he was just curious about the house. But there was something more sinister about the whole situation, something I couldn't ignore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about someone showing up at the doorbell or peeking in the window. This man had been casing the house. He had probably been watching for a while, waiting to see who was home and when. He rang the doorbell to see who would answer. When no one answered, he checked again. He was testing the situation. He wanted to see if it was only the two girls home. If he had been after something else, maybe trying to rob the place or do something worse, he wouldn't have taken his time ringing the bell. That felt deliberate. He had been checking us out, trying to see if he could get away with whatever he was planning. Maybe he didn't expect us to react the way we did. When my boyfriend chased him down the street, he probably realized he wasn't dealing with easy targets. I couldn't help but think how lucky we had been. If my boyfriend hadn't reacted so quickly, if I hadn't woken up when I did, things could have turned out much worse. We could have been completely unprepared, asleep and unaware of what was going on just outside our window. That thought alone kept me up for hours after we finally managed to get some rest. We didn't stay another night in that house. We packed up our things, thanked Amy and her roommate for their hospitality, and got back on the road. It was strange how quickly everything had shifted from fun and spontaneous to dark and unsettling. I tried to tell myself it was just an isolated incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been targeted. It made me rethink everything I had ever taken for granted. How easily someone could slip into your life unnoticed, how quickly things could go from calm to dangerous. I'll never forget that night, the man's face in the window, and the thought that he could have been watching us long before we ever saw him. It's strange to think that the real monsters aren't the ones we hear about in stories. They don't need to be supernatural or otherworldly to be terrifying. The scariest ones are the ones we don't notice until it's too late, the ones who hide in plain sight, waiting for their chance. I was driving home from work late one evening, around 11 p.m. The road I usually took was a quiet residential street, the kind that winds through neighborhoods with modest houses, well-kept lawns, and the occasional parked car. It wasn't unusual to have little traffic at that time of night, so I was cruising along, not too fast, but enough to keep a steady pace. I had the windows rolled down slightly, just enough to let in the cool air, the kind of fresh air you only get in the early hours of the morning or late at night. It was a peaceful night, and I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. As I came around a bend, I saw something that made me hesitate. In the middle of the road, there was a man standing there, his arms flailing around like he was trying to get my attention. At first, I thought maybe he was having some kind of episode, maybe even a mental breakdown, but I couldn't be sure. My headlights cast long shadows, illuminating him in the otherwise dim street. He was wearing a hoodie, and it was hard to tell much more about him from the distance. His movements were frantic, and the way he was waving his arms made me think he might have been signaling for help, though I wasn't sure what was going on. As I got closer, I slowed down, unsure whether to stop or keep going. Something about it felt off. He suddenly jerked his body forward and jumped directly in front of my car, his arms still flailing, but now it was like he was trying to force me to stop. My heart raced. I had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting him. My tires screeched on the asphalt, and the car jolted forward as the man came right up to the hood of my car. He was too close for comfort, and I could see his face now, his eyes wide, almost frantic, like he was in some kind of panic. He started yelling. The words were muffled at first, just a distant shout, but I could make out the word help, over and over again. I cracked the window just enough to hear him better. "You have to help me," he screamed, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, you have to help me." I froze for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Was this guy in trouble? Did he need help? Or was something more sinister going on? His frantic movements made it hard to gauge what was real and what wasn't. I sat there for a moment, my hand still on the steering wheel, unsure if I should get out and offer assistance or if I should just drive away. Before I could make a decision, the situation took a sudden, terrifying turn. Without warning, the man sprinted over to my passenger side. My heart skipped a beat as I saw him trying the door handle. Panic surged through me. I'd locked the car when I got in earlier, but the thought of him trying to get in sent a chill up my spine. I quickly checked the locks, making sure everything was secure. He yanked on the door, and when he realized it was locked, he moved to the back of the car, presumably to try the driver's side. That was when I couldn't sit there anymore. My fight or flight instincts kicked in full force, and I didn't think twice. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The engine roared as I sped down the street, desperately trying to get away from the madness unfolding behind me. As I accelerated, my rearview mirror showed the man sprinting after me, still yelling something, but I couldn't make out the words. I heard a thud as he struck my left rear window with his fist. The impact was so hard that it rattled the car, and I half expected the glass to shatter, but somehow it didn't. The sound of his punch echoed in the night, and I could feel my entire body tense as I pushed the car faster. I didn't dare look back until I was well out of the neighborhood. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, and my breath came in quick gasps. The adrenaline was coursing through me, making my head spin. As I finally made it onto a main road, I came upon another car driving in the opposite direction. The driver slowed down as I passed, and I could see him looking at me like he was wondering what was going on. I quickly rolled down my window, trying to make sense of the situation. The man in the other car had his window cracked too, and he leaned over, clearly concerned. "What happened?" he asked, his voice anxious. I told him what had just happened, the man trying to get in my car, how I barely escaped, and how he had punched the window before running off. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to catch up with the chaos that had just unfolded. The guy in the other car didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately cranked his wheel around in a U-turn and sped off down the street, just like I had. I drove in the opposite direction, my heart still pounding. I wasn't sure what to make of the whole thing. It didn't seem right. There had been something unsettling about that man, like he was in some kind of frantic panic, or worse, trying to trap me. But what was his game? Why had he tried to get in my car, and why had he punched the window like that? Nothing made sense. I drove aimlessly for a while, the weight of the encounter pressing down on me. I needed to tell someone what happened, but I wasn't sure who would believe me. It felt like one of those situations where if I told anyone, they'd think I was exaggerating or that I was overreacting. I didn't even want to think about what would have happened if I hadn't locked the doors, or if I hadn't reacted as quickly as I did. The next morning, I still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It was like something deep inside me knew that what I had experienced wasn't just some random act of a desperate man. No one would behave like that unless something was seriously wrong, either with them or with the situation. I found myself wondering if there was a bigger story behind the man's behavior. What had led him to act that way? Had he been alone, or was there something or someone else involved? Days went by, and I tried to forget about the whole thing. But every now and then, I'd remember the man's wild eyes, the way he lunged at my car, and how close I came to being caught in whatever madness he was part of. But then, one afternoon, I got a call from the local police department. They wanted to know if I had seen anything unusual in the neighborhood that night. Apparently, there had been reports of similar incidents, and they were trying to track down a man who had been causing trouble in the area. They asked me to come in for a statement, and I agreed. It wasn't until then that I found out just how bad it had been. There had been other reports of this same man. Several people had encountered him, and he had been acting strangely in other neighborhoods too. It turned out that he was mentally unstable and had been off his medication for a while, which explained a lot of his erratic behavior. He had a history of getting violent when he felt cornered or threatened. I was lucky I hadn't been hurt, or worse. I never saw the man again, but I always kept my doors locked when I was driving through residential streets, especially at night. I never really understood what had caused him to act like that, or what he had been trying to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something far worse. The incident stuck with me for months, and whenever I found myself driving in a quiet area, I couldn't help but remember that night. That fear, the adrenaline, the feeling of being trapped, it never quite left me. To this day, I can still hear the sound of his fist hitting my rear window, and I'll never forget how close he came to getting into my car. It's a memory I carry with me, and one that serves as a constant reminder of how quickly things can turn from normal to terrifying. It was one of those nights when everything feels still, almost too still. The kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, leaving nothing but your own thoughts and the soft shuffle of your shoes on the cracked pavement. I live in a pretty remote house on the outskirts of town. The walk home from the bus stop always takes me down a stretch of road that feels like it goes on forever. There are no streetlights, no houses, just miles and miles of thick woods and open space, with only the stars for light. Most people wouldn't even consider walking this road at night, and I don't blame them. It's pitch black out there, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. But it's home, and I've done it hundreds of times, so I'm used to it. Some nights it's beautiful. On a clear night, I can look up and see more stars than I ever thought possible. It feels like walking under a blanket of diamonds. But sometimes it's creepy as hell. That night was one of those creepy nights. It was around 2:30 in the morning, the kind of hour when even the town is asleep and everything feels off. I was walking through the tail end of town, just past the last few houses. The streetlights had started to thin out, and the houses were few and far between. Soon, I'd be stepping into the blackness, and I could already feel it hanging in the air. My headphones were broken, and I had no music to distract me. The only sound was my footsteps, the occasional rustle in the trees, and the wind whispering through the branches. There wasn't a single car in sight, no voices, no noise, just me and the night. As I walked, I started to feel that sense of isolation creeping in. It's not like I haven't walked this road at night before, but tonight was different. It wasn't the usual quiet. There was something heavier about it, something oppressive. I felt the hair on the back of my neck standing up, but I couldn't put my finger on why. It wasn't just the lack of light. It was like the air itself had a strange weight to it. I passed a few houses. They were all dark, except for one, which had a faint glow coming from a cracked window. It was a small, old house. the kind you see often in this part of town. It looked abandoned, but something about the way that light flickered made me stop in my tracks. I wasn't sure if it was the reflection of a porch light or something else, but it caught my attention. I glanced over at the window, thinking nothing of it. It was only for a second, but that's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But then I realized there was a woman standing perfectly still, pressed up against the window of the dark room. She was so still that for a second, I thought she might be a statue or something. There were no curtains, just a dark room, and her face was pressed against the glass, staring down at me. It was a blank stare, not angry or sad, just completely devoid of emotion. Her arms were at her sides, and she didn't move at all, not even a twitch. It was like she had been standing there for hours, watching me walk down the road. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at her for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Why was she just standing there, like that, in the dark? I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just a late-night insomniac or something. But the way she was just standing there, staring without blinking, felt wrong. It felt like something wasn't right, like she was waiting for me. I couldn't take it anymore. My pulse was racing, and I felt that sudden sharp spike of fear in my chest. Without thinking, I jumped back, muttering "ho-hoa" in a half-scream, half-laugh, and turned away from the window. The cold air on my face hit me like a slap, and I started walking faster, almost running now, away from the house and into the growing darkness. I knew it was stupid. I had probably just let my mind run wild, making a mountain out of a molehill. But as I walked, my legs moved faster and faster, and I found myself outpacing my own thoughts. The image of that woman's face was still stuck in my head, like a photograph I couldn't shake off. It wasn't just that she had been standing there. No, it was the way she had been staring at me. It wasn't a curious look or a friendly one. There was no emotion, no warmth in her eyes. Just nothing. I kept walking, faster now, nearly at a jog. The town had completely fallen away behind me, and I was heading into the stretch of road that led to my house. This part of the road was the worst, the part where there were no lights at all, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to swallow up any trace of the stars above. It was pitch black, the kind of dark where you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you, and the trees seemed to lean in like they were trying to trap you. I pulled my phone out and turned on the flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness in a small circle around me. The light flickered a bit in the wind, and I hurried to keep walking, my steps quick and sharp. My breath came in short bursts, and I could hear the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I kept telling myself it was nothing. There was nothing to be afraid of. But the memory of that woman's face, pressed against the window, was too fresh. It was too real. I glanced over my shoulder for no reason at all, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the dark. My heart skipped, but it was just the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing to worry about. I turned my head back around and kept walking, trying to focus on the beam of light in front of me. But the silence was deafening. There was no sound from the road, no animals, nothing. Just the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees and the faraway murmur of my own breathing. The distance between me and home felt like it stretched on forever. I kept looking at the road ahead, trying to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to that house. That woman. I didn't even know what I would have done if I had gotten closer. Would I have knocked on the door? Would I have even spoken to her? Part of me was telling myself to go back and check it out, but the other part, the smarter part, told me to keep moving. Then it hit me. I hadn't heard a single sound from the house. No creaking floors, no lights turning on, no doors opening. Nothing. If someone had been inside, you'd think they would have heard my footsteps or seen the light from my phone. But there was nothing. No movement, no sounds. It didn't make sense. By now, I was practically running. I could feel the cold sweat on my neck, but I couldn't stop. I was too far into it, too worked up. I was in the stretch of the road that led to my house now, but I couldn't shake the image of that woman staring at me from that dark window. I could still see her face in my mind's eye. It was so perfectly still, so unnervingly blank. It was like she had been waiting for me, watching me, and maybe even following me. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint outline of my house in the distance. The light from the porch glowed softly, a comforting beacon in the dark. I picked up my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and when I finally reached the door, I didn't stop to think. I just slammed my hand against the doorbell, waited for the sound of the lock turning, and pushed my way inside. The relief was immediate. The warmth of the house wrapped around me like a blanket, and I stood there, still catching my breath. I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. It was just a woman in a window, I kept telling myself. Just a strange coincidence. I was probably overreacting. But deep down, something didn't sit right. Why had she been watching me? Why had she been so still? It felt wrong. Like I had just narrowly avoided something, but I couldn't figure out what. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. And the next morning, when I walked back into town for work, I couldn't help but glance over at that house as I passed. It was still dark, still empty, still as silent as it had been the night before. But the window was completely empty. It was a warm day in early summer when I found myself walking along the familiar stretch of road that ran alongside the river. The air was thick with the scent of the damp earth and the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. My friend Jason was with me, as usual. We had spent hours exploring the woods and fields near our neighborhood, and this day was no different from any other. We'd walked this road countless times, but today, something about it felt different, like the quiet before a storm, though the sky was clear. The river had always been a part of our lives. We spent so much time wading through its shallow edges, fishing, and exploring its bends. We had both learned how to swim in that river, and we knew it like the back of our hands. There were no real dangers we could recall, or so we thought. As we walked down the dirt path, our shoes crunching against the dry ground, we spotted something unusual just ahead. A canoe, tipped over and lying on its side at the water's edge. It had been dragged partially onto the bank, the wood darkened with water stains. I wasn't sure how it had gotten there. There was no sign of anyone around, but that wasn't too surprising. People often rented canoes or kayaks from the nearby outfitter and paddled the river for hours at a time. We paused. My curiosity nudged me closer, and Jason followed. The canoe was a bit beaten up, its hull scratched and dented, but it didn't look like it had been there for too long. It was hard to resist the urge to get closer, to examine it. I had been in the river countless times before, and my feet had always stayed firm on the soft, sandy riverbed. The current wasn't too strong, and I knew exactly where to step to avoid slipping into deeper water. So, when I saw the canoe, something inside me urged me to get a closer look. "I'm going to push it back in," I said, mostly to myself, as I glanced over at Jason. "Be careful," he muttered, clearly not as eager as I was to get too close. I didn't think twice. Stepping into the river, I felt the cool water slip over my ankles and then my calves. The ground was firm under my feet. I slowly edged toward the canoe, my hand reaching out to grab its side. But just as I put all my weight into it to push it back into the water, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. It happened so fast I didn't have time to process it. The riverbed beneath my feet seemed to dissolve, as if the earth itself had opened up. My body jerked forward, and I felt myself falling. For a split second, it was like I was being sucked into a hole, a powerful force pulling me deeper, dragging me under. I couldn't see what was happening. It was just a blur of water, light, and darkness, all mixing together. I flailed, my arms reaching out for anything solid, but there was nothing to hold on to. I was being pulled deeper, tumbling like a rag doll. I couldn't even make sense of where I was. It was all just a violent rush, water rushing over me, pushing me down, and the current pulling me into its grasp. I felt a sharp, numbing cold in my chest as the water surged into my mouth, choking me, and I tried to gasp for air, but the river wouldn't let me. I was spinning, rolling through the water like a leaf caught in a storm. My head slammed into something hard, rocks, maybe. Then I was pulled again, spinning farther down the river. My body crashed into the water's surface one moment, then was pulled down again the next. I couldn't understand why the river had changed like this, why it felt as if it had turned against me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was supposed to be safe, just a kid having fun, but the undertow seemed to have other plans. I could barely hear anything over the roar of the water in my ears, but I remembered Jason's voice, faint, distant, shouting something, maybe my name. I couldn't understand him. Everything was a blur, and I could barely keep my eyes open as water sloshed around me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, I was thrust up again. The river spit me out, and I gasped, my lungs burning for air. I was floating for a moment, just long enough to take a deep breath before the undertow grabbed me once more. It sucked me down again, yanking me under with terrifying force. I tried to fight, tried to push myself toward the surface, but the current was too strong. My limbs were numb, my head heavy with the pressure of the water. I felt disoriented, like I wasn't sure if I was above or below the water. I could hear Jason now, his voice more frantic. He was running along the edge of the river, trying to keep up. "Hold on," he screamed. "I'm coming." But I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. I was dragged again, further downstream, spinning through the water. My body was battered against rocks, my head smacking against the surface before I was sucked back down again. Each time I surfaced, I felt weaker. The cold water seeped into my bones. My arms felt like dead weight, and my legs didn't want to move. The river seemed endless, the current unforgiving. Just when I thought I was too tired to keep fighting, I felt something touch my hand, something solid, a branch. I reached for it with whatever strength I had left, grabbing hold, and suddenly I was pulled. Jason had managed to grab a branch from the trees that lined the riverbank. He yanked it toward me, and I was finally able to hold on. He didn't let go. Slowly, he pulled me closer, the branch scraping against the water's surface as he struggled to get me to shore. My legs were shaking, and I could barely feel them. My heart pounded in my chest, but somehow I made it to solid ground. I collapsed on the bank, coughing up water, gasping for air. Jason stood there, panting, staring down at me, his face pale. "You're okay," he said, though I didn't think either of us was entirely sure of that. We didn't speak much after that. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, dripping wet, trying to get my bearings. My hands were shaking, my whole body trembling. We had no idea what had just happened. What kind of current could do that? Why had I been pulled under like that, over and over? Jason helped me to my feet, and we stumbled back to the road, never once looking back at the river. We didn't make another attempt at the canoe, didn't even try to figure out what had happened. All we could think about was how close I had come to not making it out of that water. We didn't tell anyone. We didn't want to get in trouble, not just for getting too close to the river, but for being so stupid. No one would have believed us anyway. How could they understand the power of that current? How could they know what it felt like to be dragged down into a dark, endless undercurrent with no control, no way to fight it? But a few days later, we learned something that changed everything. The local news reported it first. An elderly couple had drowned just upstream from where I had nearly died. Their canoe had tipped over, and the undertow had taken them both, just like it nearly took me. The couple had been around the same age as my grandparents. The article said that they hadn't stood a chance, that the current had swept them away in an instant. It hit me hard. I felt sick to my stomach. I had been nearly killed by the same river, in the same spot, and I hadn't even known it. The canoe, the current, everything, it had all lined up. That could have been me. I never went near that part of the river again, and I never talked about what happened. It felt like a warning, something I couldn't explain, but would never forget. I'd come too close to something dark, something deadly, and I was lucky to have made it out. It's a strange feeling, knowing you almost lost everything in such a quiet, unnoticed way. You don't get a second chance. You just disappear. The river didn't care, and it wasn't personal. It was just doing what it had always done, taking what it could, when it could. I was lucky, but I never took that luck for granted again. Every time I passed the river after that, I kept my distance, even when the water seemed calm and inviting. The river always remembered how to take what it wanted. When I was 13 years old, I had what I can only describe as the most unsettling and confusing experience of my life. It happened at my grandfather's house, a place I had visited countless times before, but never thought of as creepy or haunted. Until then, it had always just been Grandpa's place, a modest, quiet house on a quiet street, with brown wood paneling in the living room and a shelf full of old VHS tapes and magazines that hadn't been touched in years. My grandmother had passed away a couple of years before. She died on that very same living room couch. I remember it clearly, soft brown cushions, a fold-out bed hidden inside, and a faint floral smell that lingered on it no matter how many times you washed the covers. She died peacefully, my dad said. Took a nap one afternoon and just never woke up. It felt strange, but in a way it seemed fitting. That was her spot. She always sat there with her crossword puzzles, knitting, or watching her soaps. I didn't think much of it then, But over the years, my father and grandfather would talk about her in odd ways. Not just in memory, but in present tense. They would say things like, "She still walks to the kitchen late at night," or "Heard the fridge door again around midnight." I thought they were messing with me, having fun. I was the youngest in the family and kind of quiet, easy to mess with. I never argued, just laughed it off. I figured it was one of those family jokes that they never let go of. Until the weekend, I stayed there with my dad. It was supposed to be just a regular visit. My dad and I were going to spend the weekend helping Grandpa clean out the shed and maybe trim the hedges. Nothing big. We got there on a Saturday morning, had some lunch, watched a ball game. That evening, my grandfather was invited next door to his buddy's place for poker night. It was a usual thing. They all lived on the same street for decades and played cards every weekend. So that night, it was just me and my dad in the house. There was only one guest bed, and Grandpa had taken it for himself. So my dad and I set up on the living room couch. We pulled it out into a double bed, laid out the blankets, and got ready to sleep. It was strange lying down in the same place where Grandma had passed away. I remember staring up at the ceiling, thinking about it longer than I probably should have. But I wasn't scared. Not yet. My dad fell asleep fast. He always does. I was wide awake, flipping through an old magazine I found in the end table drawer. Something from the 80s, full of grainy ads and outdated fashion. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp across the room. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on your ears until every little sound stands out. Then I heard something, faint but clear. The sound of a door creaking open. Not a slam or a loud bang, just a slow pull. It was coming from the back of the house. The bedroom door. Next came footsteps. Not quick or heavy, just slow, shuffling steps. Like someone walking in slippers, dragging their feet across the floor. They moved from the bedroom down the hall and paused by the bathroom. I heard the familiar creak of the wooden floorboard just outside the bathroom door. A spot that always groaned when someone stepped on it. That creak was unmistakable. The footsteps kept going, slow and steady, toward the kitchen. Then the sound of the refrigerator door being opened. A click, a swoosh of suction being broken. Then the soft clinking of glass bottles rattling against each other. I knew that sound too. Grandpa still bought soda in glass bottles, storing them in the door of the fridge. When you opened it quickly, they knocked together just like that. I figured Grandpa was back. Maybe the poker game ended early. I wasn't scared. In fact, I was kind of thirsty myself. I got up, careful not to wake my dad, and made my way toward the kitchen. I turned the corner and stopped. The kitchen was empty. The fridge door was closed. The lights were off. There was no one there. No footsteps, no sounds. Just silence. I looked around, confused. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. I could have sworn I heard Grandpa walk in and go to the fridge. I listened for more sounds. Nothing. Then I remembered, Grandpa wasn't home. He was still next door. He had only left an hour or so ago. He couldn't have come back without me hearing the front door. And my dad was still snoring on the couch. My mouth went dry. My legs felt stiff. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, turned, and practically dove back into the bed next to my dad. I pulled the blanket over me and lay there, eyes wide open, heart pounding. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I remember was waking up in a complete state of panic. My whole body was locked in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't even open my mouth. It felt like something was pressing down on me, holding me in place. I was lying on my right side, facing the back of the couch. I stayed like that for a while, maybe minutes, maybe longer. I could feel my breathing getting faster, but I couldn't make my limbs respond. I wanted to turn over. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. And then I heard it again. Breathing. Not mine. Heavy, deep, slow breaths. Like someone standing just behind me. I pulled the blanket tighter over my head, hoping the sound would go away. But it didn't. Then I saw it. A shadow, cast onto the fabric of the blanket, right in front of my eyes. It was the outline of a head and shoulders, the shape of a woman, and her hair, a rounded beehive shape. My heart jumped. That's how my grandmother always wore her hair. Even after the style went out of fashion, she kept it that way. Everyone teased her for it, but she never cared. It was her signature look. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, and the breathing continued. I don't know how long I stayed like that. My fingers were numb from holding the blanket so tight. Eventually, I forced myself to move my hand. I lifted the blanket just enough to peek out. Nothing. The room was empty. No shadow. No sound. My dad was still asleep, mouth open, oblivious. As soon as I realized it was gone, the fear left me. Just like that. It was like someone had hit a switch. I felt completely normal again. I sighed, pulled the blanket back over my head, and tried to sleep. But it wasn't long before it started again. I woke up on my right side, paralyzed. The same pressure, the same panic, the same slow, heavy breathing. I didn't even have to look. I knew the shadow was there. I could feel it. I forced myself again to move, to pull the blanket down. Gone. This happened over and over again. I lost count. Maybe a dozen times. Maybe more. Each time the same. I would fall asleep, wake up frozen with fear, hear the breathing, see the shadow. Then I would summon the strength to lift the blanket, and everything would vanish. There was never anything in the room. The door never moved. No wind, no creaks. Just that overwhelming feeling of being watched, of something standing over me. I started to wonder if I was dreaming, but it didn't feel like dreams. Every time it happened, I was aware of everything around me. I could hear my dad snoring, the clock ticking, the fridge humming in the distance. Morning eventually came. Light filtered through the windows, and I finally felt like I could breathe normally. I sat up, exhausted, my back sore from the terrible sleep. My dad yawned and stretched next to me, completely unaware of what kind of night I had just had. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't ready to talk about it. I didn't know if it had been real or just some kind of mental trick. But it didn't feel like imagination. It didn't feel like a dream. When I eventually told my dad what happened, he didn't look surprised. He just gave a small smile, like he knew all along. That only made me feel weirder. It made everything more real. I didn't go back to Grandpa's house for a long time after that. When I finally did, things felt normal again. I never heard those sounds again. Never saw the shadow. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was grief manifesting in some strange way. Maybe it was the stories I had been told over the years getting under my skin. Maybe it was sleep paralysis. Maybe it was just coincidence. But something happened. Something I can't explain. And I still remember that shadow, that breathing, that feeling of being frozen and completely helpless, as clearly as if it happened yesterday. And no matter how many years go by, that night will always stay with me. I've got a story for you. It's a bit of a strange one, but something that really made me realize how quickly things can go from ordinary to downright terrifying, and how sometimes the scariest situations can end in the most absurd way. This isn't my story, but it's worth telling because it kind of lightens the mood, especially considering how crazy the world can get sometimes. It's a reminder that sometimes all the fear we build up in our heads can just evaporate in the most bizarre way. So, here's what happened to this guy I know. Let's just call him Mark. He's a decent guy, a family man, the kind of guy you'd expect to be calm and collected in most situations. Mark had recently become a father. His little girl was still a baby, just a few months old at the time. That kind of change in someone's life is huge, right? You go from thinking about your own safety and well-being to obsessing over the protection of someone so small and vulnerable. That's exactly where Mark was in his life. He wanted to make sure that his family was safe, that his daughter would always be protected, no matter what. A few weeks before the story, there had been a string of break-ins in his neighborhood. It wasn't anything huge, but people's garages and cars were getting broken into. The kind of stuff you don't think about until it's too late. So, Mark did what any responsible father would do in that situation. He bought a gun. Not that he was some kind of gun enthusiast or a paranoid prepper, but he felt like it was the right thing to do. He wasn't looking for trouble, just trying to keep his family safe. One Friday night, not too long after he got the gun, Mark went out to grab some Chinese food for dinner. He had his wife and the baby at home, and it was supposed to be just a normal, relaxing evening. He was just driving, enjoying the drive to pick up his food, when he noticed something odd. There was a car behind him, and it was tailing him closely. Now, if you've ever driven in Florida, you'll know that people drive pretty aggressively down there. Everyone's always in a hurry, and it's not unusual for someone to follow you for a while, especially when they're just trying to get ahead in traffic. So, Mark didn't think much of it at first. He figured it was just some impatient driver trying to get past him. But the car didn't go around him like he expected. Instead, it just stayed behind him. Mark made a couple of turns, and the car followed him, still not passing him. It was starting to feel a bit off. You know that gut feeling, the one you can't really explain, but something inside you just says this isn't right. He took another turn, and this time, the car started honking its horn. Not in a friendly, "Hey, I'm in a hurry" kind of way, but in a more aggressive, persistent kind of way. Mark's heart started racing. Now, he was starting to freak out. He sped up a little, thinking maybe the car would back off if he went faster. But it didn't. The car stayed right on his tail. Mark took another sharp turn, and the car followed, still honking and flashing its lights. At this point, Mark's anxiety was through the roof. He was gripping the steering wheel tight, trying to figure out what to do. It wasn't like him to get rattled, but this situation was escalating. He was driving faster now, trying to get home, trying to outrun whatever was going on. He had this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe this wasn't just some random road rage incident. The car behind him wasn't leaving, and every time he looked in his rearview mirror, it was still there, right behind him. Mark's mind started racing. What if this wasn't just some idiot on the road? What if it was someone with bad intentions? Someone who knew he was alone, and maybe didn't like that he had a gun. His mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was a robbery. Maybe someone was just trying to intimidate him. Or maybe, worst of all, the person in the car had been watching his house and knew that he had a family there. He finally pulled into his driveway, heart pounding in his chest. Mark slammed the car into park and quickly got out, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror as he made his way to the front door. He rushed inside, slammed the door behind him, and locked it. He immediately told his wife to get their daughter and hide in the bathroom. She could see the panic in his eyes, so she didn't ask any questions. She just grabbed the baby and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Mark didn't waste a second. He ran to the bedroom, pulled the gun out from under the bed, and checked to make sure it was loaded. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he wasn't going to take any chances. His family's safety was all that mattered right now. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911, telling them there was someone outside his house, and he didn't know if they were going to try to break in or what. He was in full survival mode now, ready to protect his family no matter what it took. He stood at the front door, gun in hand, his heart hammering in his chest. Every little sound outside seemed amplified. The wind rustling through the trees, the distant sounds of cars passing by. But then, he heard something that froze him in his tracks. There was someone walking slowly on his lawn. He didn't know if it was the same car from earlier or someone else, but he couldn't take the risk. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. He heard the sound of a hand resting against the door, followed by a knock. The knocking wasn't frantic, though. It was slow, deliberate. Mark's blood ran cold. He stood there, motionless for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. He gripped the gun tighter, trying to steady his hands, but he could feel the sweat dripping down his face. He didn't know who it was. Was this the moment someone was going to try to break in? Was this a robbery? His mind raced, but he didn't hesitate. He yelled out, his voice shaking. "I have a gun. I called the police. Get off my property." For a moment, there was silence. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest as he waited, expecting the worst. Then, just as he was about to open the door to confront whoever was on the other side, he heard a voice. It wasn't a threatening voice. It wasn't a man's voice at all. The voice was a bit shaky, and it sounded almost embarrassed. "Sir," the voice said, "you forgot your fried rice." For a moment, Mark didn't know what to think. He stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had he heard that right? The footsteps on his lawn, the knocking, it was a delivery driver. It was his Chinese food. The one thing that had been so normal just a few minutes ago had spiraled into a nightmare scenario in his head. Mark opened the door slowly, and sure enough, there stood the delivery driver, holding a bag of food in one hand and looking very, very confused. Mark, still in a daze, realized he must have panicked so badly that he completely forgot about his order. The delivery driver had probably been waiting outside for a minute, wondering why the customer wasn't answering the door. And in Mark's state of mind, everything had gotten blown completely out of proportion. He stood there, feeling both relieved and incredibly embarrassed. He had the gun in his hand, and his mind had been racing with fear, but in the end, it was just a case of his mind getting ahead of reality. The driver, probably more than a little confused himself, handed over the fried rice and chicken with a nervous smile. Mark apologized, probably more times than he needed to, before taking the food inside. He checked on his wife and daughter, both of whom were still huddled in the bathroom. He didn't even tell them the full story that night. They didn't need to know how close he'd come to freaking out for no reason. As ridiculous as it was, Mark learned something that night. Fear has a way of spiraling out of control. It can make the most innocent of situations feel life-threatening, and sometimes it's easy to let your imagination run wild. But in the end, things don't always go as badly as we think they will. Sometimes the scariest moments end with the most ordinary, laughable outcomes. And that's exactly what happened here. Just a guy, his gun, his fried rice, and a night that was a lot scarier in his head than in reality. I was 9 years old, riding my bike down a gravel road that twisted through thick woods. It was a hot summer day, and my best friend Alex and I had been waiting all week to get out of the house. We lived in a small town, so there wasn't much to do except explore the woods and creeks around us. We were pretty used to it. There were certain spots that felt like secret places, hidden quiet, where nobody else seemed to go. One of those spots was a secluded series of rapids we had discovered a few months earlier. We didn't tell anyone about it, not even our parents, because it felt like it belonged to just us. The rapids were tucked away, deep in the woods, and the water rushed over the rocks, making a loud, soothing sound. The trees were so dense there, their branches and leaves so thick, that the sunlight barely made it to the ground. It was always cool and shaded, and we'd ride out there with our bikes to explore the rocks and the water, sometimes just sitting and watching the current for hours. That day, we decided to ride our bikes all the way to the rapids again. The heat was intense, and it felt good to be out in nature, away from the stuffy feeling of the house. Alex and I were both excited, laughing as we pedaled fast down the long, winding road. Our bikes bounced over the gravel as we passed the familiar landmarks, old barns, tall fences, and the occasional rundown truck. We knew the area like the back of our hands. After about 20 minutes of riding, we turned off the main road and onto a small, overgrown path that led into the woods. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a bike, and we had to slow down to avoid hitting the branches. It was the kind of path you'd only find if you knew where it was. So hidden, it felt like a secret passage. We'd gone down it dozens of times before, but this time, something felt a little off. It's hard to explain. The air seemed heavier, thicker. Alex seemed to feel it too. He kept glancing around, his eyes darting from tree to tree, but he didn't say anything. We kept riding, though, pushing through the dense woods until the sound of the rapids came into earshot. I felt a relief wash over me as the water's rushing noise filled my ears, and I breathed out, eager to reach the familiar spot. We were almost there when we saw them. 3 older boys stepped out from the shadows of the trees, blocking the path in front of us. I didn't recognize them, but they were definitely older than us, probably in their teens, maybe 15 or 16. They were wearing tattered clothes, their faces dirty and rough-looking. There was something about them that made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. I tried to ignore the rising unease in my stomach and hoped they'd just move out of the way. But they didn't. Instead, they started walking towards us, their eyes narrowing, their steps slow and deliberate. My heart began to race, and I exchanged a quick look with Alex, who was starting to look just as nervous. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, something cold crawling up my spine. One of the boys spoke, but I couldn't make out the words, not at first. All I could focus on was the way they were circling around us, closing in slowly. I looked over my shoulder, realizing that the path we'd come down was blocked now. There was no easy way out. "Where do you think you're going?" one of them said, his voice rough and threatening. The words hit me like a cold slap, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But I froze, not sure what to do. My bike felt suddenly heavy, like a weight I couldn't shake off. The boy in the middle, taller than the others, had a rope in his hand. Another boy was holding a chain, and I could see the glint of it in the light filtering through the trees. They were closing in, and I could feel my stomach turn. The older boy stepped closer, and the other 2 followed, their movements synchronized, like they were used to doing this. The ropes were tied to one another, looping like they were planning on tying us up. My heart pounded in my chest, and Alex, who was usually the braver one of us, seemed just as scared as I was. His hands were gripping his bike, knuckles white. His eyes flicked between the boys and me, and I could tell he was trying to think of something, anything, to get us out of this situation. That's when I saw it, their eyes. There was something dark behind them, something angry. They weren't just some random kids playing a prank. They had a purpose. The fear began to grow in my chest, threatening to choke me. My legs felt weak, and my mind went blank, except for one thought: run. We had to get out of there. In a split second, Alex's hand shot out, grabbing mine. Without thinking, we both turned and pedaled as hard as we could. My breath came in short, terrified bursts as we raced back down the path, not even looking back. My heart was hammering in my chest. The only sound in my ears was the rush of the wind and the thundering of my pulse. I could hear the boys behind us shouting, but I didn't dare turn around to look. We didn't stop until we reached the gravel road, where we turned sharply and sped away from the woods, the sound of our bikes crashing over the gravel now loud in the silence between us. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, the one that led back into town. We didn't even slow down until we were sure they weren't following us anymore. Our legs burned from the effort, and I felt sick from the panic that had gripped me just moments before. We didn't say anything for a long time, just rode side by side, trying to catch our breath. The whole time, my mind kept racing, replaying the moments when I thought we might not make it out of there. I couldn't shake the image of those older boys, their cold, calculating eyes. When we finally made it back to the safety of our neighborhood, I still couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had followed me all the way home. I didn't tell my parents what had happened, not then. I didn't want to scare them, and part of me just wanted to forget about it, pretend it hadn't happened at all. But I couldn't. Several weeks later, the news started to spread through town, but I didn't make the connection at first. There had been an arrest in the local area, a policeman of all people. Turns out, the father of one of the boys we had encountered at the rapids was a cop. His name was Officer Logan, and he had been living with his family in a small house on the outskirts of town. The investigation revealed that Officer Logan had been sexually abusing his daughters for years. His own children, along with several others who lived in the house, probably at least 10 in total. The police had been investigating him for months, gathering evidence, and when they finally moved in, they found what they feared they would: the evidence of horrific crimes. The entire town was shocked. How could someone so trusted be capable of such things? And how had none of us known? But what truly turned my stomach was what happened next. Officer Logan, once he was arrested, took his own life. He blew his brains out in his squad car before he could be processed, before he could even be questioned about his crimes. It was later, when we heard the details from other kids in town, that the horrible truth came to light. One of the boys we had seen that day, the one who had been holding the rope, was his son. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If we had been caught, if we hadn't run, if that boy had caught us, things could have turned out very differently. The anger, the violence, the years of torment his family had endured, all of it could have been unleashed on us. I can't even imagine what would have happened. It makes me sick to think about it. The police investigation eventually uncovered how many victims had been trapped in that house, how many children had been forced to endure the nightmare. It was hard to wrap my head around. But what was even harder to accept was the thought of how close we had been to being part of that nightmare, how we had barely escaped. Alex and I didn't talk about that day much after it happened. We didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between us. We both knew how lucky we were. As time went on, life carried on as it always did, but that day, that experience stayed with me. It changed how I viewed the world, how I viewed trust, and it never fully left me, not even now. Looking back, I can't help but think that if we hadn't made it out of there, if we had been just a little slower or a little more naive, we might have been another set of victims, lost to the darkness in that house, forgotten by everyone except for the people who could never forget what happened to them. But somehow we had gotten away, and I'm thankful for that every single day. When I was a young kid, my room was in the spacious downstairs rumpus area. It was a part of the house that felt separate from the rest of the family. I had free roam of the space, but the fact that it was so far away from everyone else at night always made me uneasy. The darkness of the downstairs seemed to stretch out endlessly, and the noise from the house upstairs, like the creak of floorboards or muffled voices, felt distant and disconnected, as if it were happening in another world. I would hear the soft murmur of my parents talking, the thud of my siblings running around, but none of it felt close enough to reach me, like I was too far removed. For the most part, I liked it. I felt independent. My parents would sometimes check in, but I had my own space, my own routine, and it gave me a feeling of freedom. The only problem was that at night, the space below the stairs felt like it was full of its own secrets, like there were things moving in the corners of the room when the lights went out. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, but I knew something wasn't right. I tried not to think about it, but no matter how hard I tried, the unease remained. One part of my nightly routine I looked forward to, though, was my father's old hi-fi system. He'd set up a CD player in the corner of the room, along with a stack of albums that I could choose from before bed. There was a sense of comfort in the ritual. He would put on whatever CD I chose, usually something mellow, like Pink Floyd or the Stranglers, and the music would play softly as I drifted off to sleep. The sound of the gentle hum of the amplifier, the warm static of the speakers, would lull me into a sense of calm. It became a nightly ritual, something that made me feel safe and at ease. Sometimes, I'd fall asleep in the middle of a song, the music acting as a gentle blanket that kept the nightmares at bay. But then one night, everything changed. It started the way most nightmares do, slowly, without warning. I woke up to an odd silence. It wasn't just the absence of music, it was a deeper, unsettling silence that seemed to pulse in the air. The soft hum of the amplifier was gone, but the lights on the front of it still flickered erratically. The faint red glow of the amplifier lights gave the room an eerie, half-lit atmosphere. It was disorienting, as if something was off, but nothing had physically changed. Still groggy, I staggered out of bed. My mind was still foggy from sleep, but I could tell something wasn't right. The room felt too still, too empty. The music should have been playing, but instead, there was nothing but the odd flickering light and an uncomfortable stillness that I couldn't shake. I stumbled over to the CD player, my hand reaching out instinctively to turn it off. But as I touched the metal of the amplifier, I was hit by something, an overwhelming sensation that I can only describe as static, like electricity coursing through the air. The feeling was intense, like pins and needles crawling across every inch of my body. But it wasn't painful, not exactly. It was more like a vibration, deep inside my bones, as if the very air around me had become charged. I could feel it creeping through my skin, my fingertips, like I was being used as an antenna for something that was trying to tune into me. The feeling was all-consuming, like it was inside me, outside me, everywhere, all at once. Every hair on my body stood on end, the sensation so strong that it felt like my entire body was vibrating with energy. I tried to move, to pull away, but it was like the static had taken hold of me, binding me in place. I felt paralyzed, like I was locked in a battle with my own body. I couldn't scream or even shout out, couldn't ask for help. All I could do was stand there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The static sensation seemed to linger for what felt like an eternity, the feeling so pervasive that it started to fill the air around me, turning everything in the room a little more oppressive. As the static began to fade, I was able to move again, but it was slow, as if every movement took all of my strength. I stumbled back toward the bed, my legs shaky, and pulled the covers up over me, desperately trying to hide from the feeling that seemed to be closing in on me. But even under the covers, it wasn't over. The feeling was still there, not physically, but emotionally. It was like a presence, an energy that was hanging just at the edge of my awareness. Not in a visual sense, but in an instinctual way. I could feel it, as if something was watching me. Not a person, not a ghost, but something darker, something heavier. It was a shadow that seemed to press in on me, filling the room with a heavy, suffocating sense of malevolence. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it like a weight in the air. It wasn't a terrifying feeling, not exactly. But it was unnerving, like I was being monitored, observed by something that was both curious and disinterested in my presence. It wasn't threatening, but it felt wrong, like a storm on the horizon, just waiting to break. I remember the logical part of my mind kicking in, telling me to do something, anything, to stop this. But all I could think of was to remain still. If I didn't respond, if I didn't move, maybe it would go away. Maybe it couldn't affect me if I just stayed perfectly still, as if pretending to be invisible would somehow make me safe. So, I did the only thing that seemed to make sense in that moment. I played dead. I didn't even dare to move a muscle, not even a twitch of my fingers. I lay there, holding my breath, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't notice me. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. But eventually, the feeling began to fade. The oppressive weight lifted, the static sensation dissipated, and the room returned to its usual quiet. It didn't disappear completely, but it was less intense, less pressing. After a while, I must have drifted off to sleep. But even in my sleep, I could feel that strange, lingering presence. The next night, it happened again, and again, and again. Every single night, without fail, I would experience the same strange sensation. The music would stop, the amplifier lights would flicker, and I would be overwhelmed by the static. The feeling of being watched, the weight of something unseen, would fill the room, and I would do the same thing. I would lie perfectly still, holding my breath, hoping it would go away. And eventually it would. I don't know why I wasn't more scared. I wasn't terrified in the way most people might expect from something like this. I wasn't cowering in fear or screaming for help. Instead, I felt more confused. What was it? Why did it keep happening? Why was I the only one experiencing it? It wasn't malicious, but it wasn't friendly either. It was like something much larger than me, something that had control over my senses, over my body, but not in a way that made me feel physically harmed. It was like I was caught in the middle of something far beyond my understanding, and the only thing I could do was endure it. As the nights went on, the sensation became almost familiar, like an unwanted visitor that I had learned to live with. It didn't frighten me the way it once did, but it didn't exactly comfort me either. It was simply there, like the hum of a faulty appliance or the buzz of a broken light that you can't quite fix. You learn to tune it out, even if you can still feel it, lurking at the edges of your mind. Eventually, the nightmares stopped. I don't know when exactly, but one night, I woke up and realized that the feeling wasn't there. The music still played, the amplifier lights still flickered, but the strange static sensation, the oppressive weight, had disappeared. It was like something had finally shifted, like the frequency had changed, and whatever had been haunting me had moved on. The room felt normal again, and I could breathe easily. I never told anyone about it, not then. I don't think I could have explained it, even if I had wanted to. It was one of those things that I couldn't quite understand, and so I just kept it to myself, like a memory that I wasn't sure was real or just something my mind had conjured up. But looking back now, I can't help but wonder if it was something deeper, something beyond just the static of a malfunctioning amplifier. Maybe it was just a part of growing up, or maybe it was something that happened because I was alone too often, separated from my family in that big, empty space. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I don't think it was. The strange thing is, I never felt scared of it. More than anything, I was just confused. Why was I the only one experiencing it? What was it trying to tell me? Why did it want me to stay still, to not respond to it? I still don't know the answer to those questions, but I'll never forget that sensation. The way it felt like the room was full of something else, something much bigger than me, something that could control the very air around me. And though it was never overtly hostile, it was always there, lurking just out of reach, like a memory I couldn't quite recall. Even now, I can still feel it when I close my eyes and think back. Back when I was in college, about 7 years ago, I found myself scrambling to find a place to live. The semester was coming to an end, and I had procrastinated like any typical college student, leaving everything to the last minute. My parents had come into town for a visit and were eager to help me figure out housing, but I hadn't made any plans, so they were slightly stressed as well. It wasn't that I hadn't been trying to find something decent. I just hadn't been motivated enough to really dig into it. I was content living in my apartment, even though it wasn't the most convenient place. But now it was time to move, and I needed something fast. After a day of driving around looking at overpriced and unappealing apartments, we finally found something that fit my budget. It was a basement apartment right in front of the university, so it was convenient, and it was cheap, which made my parents happy. It seemed like a quick solution. I was just relieved to have the ordeal behind me. The basement apartment was in an older building that had been converted into several units. It was one of those places that looked decent on the surface, but there was something about it that didn't quite sit right with me. Still, at that moment, I wasn't looking for a place to live for the long term, so I wasn't picky. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a bit of a weathered look, told us the place was available because the last tenant had canceled last minute. He was offering it to me for a great deal, only 3 months for the summer. My parents didn't ask too many questions, and I was too tired to care. They were just happy I had a roof over my head. The layout of the basement was a bit strange. The main room was large and served as both the living room and the dining area. A small table was tucked into one corner, and the space felt comfortable enough. On the right side, there was a small kitchen that was functional, though it looked like it hadn't been updated in a while. Right next to the kitchen was the bathroom. On the left side of the living room, there was a bedroom. The strange part was the little hall that connected the bedroom to the main living area. It wasn't really a hallway, just a small connection that didn't make much sense. It was odd and a little cramped, but I didn't think much of it at first. From the moment I moved in, I had this weird feeling about the bedroom. There was something unsettling about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to ignore it, but every time I passed by it or glanced inside, it felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just a passing thought either. It was a lingering sensation, one that stayed with me even when I wasn't looking directly at the room. At night, I would sleep in the living room. There was a comfy sofa bed that I would pull out and stretch out on. I never even considered sleeping in the bedroom. It didn't have any windows, and I felt uncomfortable just thinking about it. The living room was fine. I had a TV, and I could watch shows or play video games to pass the time. But every so often, when I was alone, I would feel like there was someone else in the apartment with me. It wasn't like I could hear footsteps or see anything odd. It was just a feeling that something was there, lurking in the background. It was unnerving, to say the least. I started closing the door to the bedroom completely when I wasn't in there, just to block off whatever was making me feel uneasy. I spent most of my time at school or hanging out with friends, so the feeling didn't always bother me. But when I came back late at night, especially if I had been out drinking or at a party, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone in that apartment. It was more than just the usual feeling of being paranoid. It was as though the apartment itself was watching me. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't like I was hearing things or seeing shadows move, but the feeling was there, creeping up on me. I remember one night, after a long day of classes, I returned to the apartment and just sat on the couch in the living room. I had my phone out, scrolling through social media, when I suddenly felt the overwhelming sense that someone was standing in the bedroom, staring at me. It wasn't even a vague feeling. It was distinct. My skin prickled, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned quickly to look at the bedroom door, which was closed. But there was no one there. No sound, no movement, just that heavy feeling of being watched. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't like I had seen a ghost or anything. It was just the overwhelming sense of unease. And for some reason, I started to avoid the bedroom altogether. I would leave the door closed and only ever go in there when absolutely necessary, like to grab clothes or something. There was never any concrete reason for my unease, just a gut feeling that something was off. It didn't help that there were no windows in that room. It felt like it was sealed off from the rest of the world. I ended up staying over at friends' apartments more often than I stayed at mine, partly because I liked hanging out with them, but also because it felt safer. When I was at their places, I didn't have that lingering feeling that I wasn't alone. But even when I did spend time at my apartment, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was subtle, but it was always there, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. One weekend, I met up with a friend from college who I hadn't seen in a while. We got to talking about the old places we had lived, and I mentioned the weird basement apartment I had moved into. I didn't go into detail about the creepy feeling. It just didn't seem worth it. But when I mentioned the room and how uncomfortable I felt in it, my friend's face changed. He looked at me seriously and asked, "Was that the place with the weird little hallway?" I nodded, confused by his sudden shift in demeanor. "Man, that place is messed up," he said. "You know, I remember hearing something about that apartment when we were still in school. Something about the last tenant. It's not like it's a huge thing, but it's definitely weird." I was intrigued, but I didn't press him further. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just another one of those college gossip things. Time passed, and eventually, I moved on from that apartment. I finished my semester, packed up, and found a new place for the next year. I didn't give the old basement apartment much thought after that. Life went on, and I graduated and moved on to new chapters. But the memory of the creepy feeling in that place lingered in the back of my mind. I still didn't have an explanation for it, but I had shrugged it off as just an overactive imagination. 2 years ago, I got a text from an old college friend. He had been digging through old local newspapers at the library, looking for pictures from his football days, when he stumbled upon something that made him think of me. It was an obituary section from 2009. He sent me a picture of a page from the newspaper, and my heart dropped as soon as I saw it. There, in the obituary section, was a picture of a young woman. She had that typical college student look, bright eyes, a friendly smile, and an aura of innocence about her. But what struck me was the address next to her picture. It was the same address of the apartment I had lived in, the very same building. The obituary said that she had died in 2009. The cause of death? Suicide. She had hung herself in the very bedroom that I had always felt uneasy about. The closet. I froze as I read the words. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The feeling I had been experiencing, the sense that I wasn't alone, had a reason. That strange, suffocating atmosphere in that apartment. The way I always felt like I was being watched suddenly made sense. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know how to process it either. I never believed in ghosts or any of that paranormal stuff. But there was something undeniably wrong about that apartment. Maybe it wasn't the house itself. Maybe it was just the history that had seeped into the walls. Maybe the memories of the woman who had died there had left a lingering presence, an energy that stayed even after her death. After receiving the text from my friend, I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I never told anyone about how I had felt when I lived there. I never wanted to admit that I had been scared for no reason, but now I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. That feeling, that constant sense of unease, had been justified. It wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just me being paranoid. That woman's death, the tragedy that had occurred in that very room, had left an indelible mark on the place. And I was the one who had lived there, feeling her presence, feeling her loss, without even knowing why. I never spoke to my parents about it, and I never went back to that apartment after I moved out. It's funny how life works sometimes, how things we can't explain follow us, long after we think they've been left behind. I used to be left alone a lot as a kid. My mom would spend the night at her boyfriend's house, leaving me to fend for myself in the silence of our old house. It wasn't the kind of house I ever felt safe in, even when my mom was home. It creaked and groaned with every shift in the wind, and the old floorboards in the hallway would snap and pop as if they were alive. There were nights when I'd lie awake listening to those sounds, pretending they didn't bother me, trying to convince myself I was just hearing things. But there was one sound that wasn't so easy to ignore. It started on a Friday evening, just like any other night. I'd gotten home from school, eaten dinner, and plopped myself down in front of the TV, flipping through channels. The house felt strange and empty, but that wasn't unusual. I was used to being alone. I had my cat, Tiger, to keep me company, and I had the television to drown out the silence. Everything was fine until I heard it. At first, it was a light tapping noise. It sounded like someone was walking on the roof, their boots clicking against the shingles. I froze, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out if it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate footstep, followed by another, then another. My heart started to race. I grabbed my phone, shaking as I dialed my mom's number. She picked up after a few rings, her voice groggy, probably from just getting settled at her boyfriend's house. "Mom, there's someone on the roof," I said, my voice trembling. I knew it probably sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore the sound. It was too real. "Sweetie, there's nobody on the roof. You're just hearing things. It's probably just the house settling," she said, her voice calm, dismissive. "Turn up the TV or something. You're fine." I was confused. "But Mom, it's not the house. It sounds like footsteps, like someone walking up there." "Trust me, it's in your head," she said. "Just relax, all right? You'll be fine." I hung up, feeling frustrated. What was I supposed to do? I didn't want to seem crazy, but the sound was still there, getting louder and closer, like whoever, or whatever, was walking was right above my room. I turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown it out, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept going, pacing back and forth on the roof, always when I was alone. Sometimes I'd hear them at night, sometimes during the day when I was left by myself. As the weeks went on, the footsteps became a regular occurrence. Every time my mom was away, I'd hear them. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But the more it happened, the more I became certain that someone was up there. It wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate. And it always happened when I was alone, as if whatever it was knew that my mom wouldn't believe me. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. My mom had brushed it off, and I didn't want to keep bothering her with it. Every time I'd mention the noises, she'd say the same thing. "It's just the house. The house creaks." The house settles, but it wasn't settling. I knew the difference between a house groaning and someone walking on a roof. I stopped trying to call my mom about it. It felt pointless, so I kept it to myself. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps kept happening, never at any set time, always when I was alone. I would lie in bed at night, trying to ignore the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise would always stop just when I was about to break down and call my mom again. It felt like whatever it was up there was playing a game, tormenting me with its silent, steady steps. After months of this, I was no longer sure if I was imagining it, but I still didn't know what to do. I was scared, really scared. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't take it anymore. That's when my mom finally heard it. I was in my room, lying on my bed and listening to the sound above. The steps were slow, deliberate, and just as creepy as ever. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. Tiger, my cat, had been acting strange too. He'd sit by the window, staring up at the roof with wide, nervous eyes. I wondered if he heard it too. Then, out of nowhere, I heard my mom call from downstairs. "Did you hear that?" I froze. "What?" "I just heard it," she said, sounding startled. "It sounds like footsteps on the roof. Are you sure it's not just you hearing things?" "No, Mom. It's real. I'm telling you, it's real. I'm not crazy." She paused. Okay, calm down. Maybe it's a mouse in the attic. That would explain the noise. Let me check it out." I was relieved she finally believed me, but I didn't think it was a mouse. I had a bad feeling about it. My mom didn't seem as concerned as I was, but she agreed to look into it. We spent hours setting up traps around the house, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise. We tried everything: mouse traps, rat traps, even small animal bear claw traps. But nothing worked. Every trap we set was either stolen or emptied out by the next morning. Whatever was on the roof was smart, and it was getting more and more frustrating. Then one evening, the noise stopped. The roof was quiet for the first time in months. I was relieved, but also suspicious. I wasn't sure if whatever it was gone, or if it was just waiting for the right moment to make its move again. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in. The sky was dark, the air thick with the promise of rain. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps again, this time louder than ever. But something was different. The footsteps were frantic, almost desperate, as if whatever it was on the roof was trying to get inside. Tiger had been staring at the ceiling for hours, his fur standing on end. He was on edge, and I could feel it too. The storm raged on outside, and the thunder shook the walls, but I couldn't stop listening to the noise above. It sounded like it was clawing at the roof, like something was trying to get through. I was terrified. I called my mom's boyfriend, who had a way of dismissing things with a laugh. But this time, he didn't laugh. He said, "I'm coming over. We'll deal with this." When he arrived, he was chewing tobacco, his hands shaking slightly, and he carried a bat. He climbed up on the roof, determined to confront whatever was up there. The storm had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick. I stood below, staring up, my heart pounding. He wasn't going to let whatever it was get away. The creature stopped when it saw him. I didn't understand what was happening at first, but then he shouted, "I see you." And there, hidden in the shadows, I saw it. The eyes of the creature were covered by a black mask, just like a bandit. It was human-like, but it moved like an animal. The realization hit me all at once. It was no animal. It was someone, or something, living up there, trying to stay hidden. My mom's boyfriend didn't hesitate. He swung the bat, but the creature darted back into the shadows, vanishing. The whole thing was over as quickly as it had started, but I knew we weren't done with it. We sealed the hole in the roof, the one we thought might have been the entry point for whatever had been up there. And for a while, everything seemed quiet again. But then months later, it came back. Only this time, it wasn't on the roof. I came home one afternoon, feeling strange. The air was still. I walked up to my room, and something felt wrong. My light was off, which was odd because I was the kind of kid who always left it on. I stepped into my room, flicking the light switch, and that's when I saw it. There, sitting on my desk, was a gigantic raccoon. At first, I thought it was another one of those creatures, but then I realized it wasn't. It was just a raccoon. A big one. My mom and her boyfriend had set it up there, and when they saw my face, they both burst out laughing. "You really thought there was something on the roof?" my mom's boyfriend said, still chuckling. I felt a mix of anger and relief. That thing that had haunted me for months, the thing that had nearly convinced me I was losing my mind, turned out to be just a raccoon. A raccoon that my mom and her boyfriend had been messing with the whole time, making me believe it was something far worse. It wasn't until years later, when I moved out of my apartment, that I donated the raccoon to a couple of random neighborhood boys who were thrilled to have it. They didn't know the story, and I didn't tell them, but I couldn't help but smile when I saw them carrying it around like it was some kind of prize. The creature was gone, but the memory lingered. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. But sometimes, I still wonder what else could be out there, just waiting to make its move. I was about 13 years old, maybe a little older, maybe not, but that age where you're still sort of a kid, but starting to feel like you're not. I remember it was a Sunday afternoon in early spring. The kind of day where everything feels a little off. Not cold, not warm, not rainy, but not dry either. The sky was this dull, heavy gray, not like a storm was coming, just thick and low, like a wet wool blanket pressing down over everything. The sun hadn't come out at all, and under the trees, it felt almost like twilight. I was walking back to my Nana's house. She lived on the edge of a small town, way out where the yards get bigger and houses farther apart. Behind her place there was this little patch of pine woods, just a small stand of trees that had been there probably forever. It wasn't big enough to be called a forest, but it was big enough that once you were a few steps in, you couldn't see the houses anymore. The needles on the ground were packed thick and soft, and it was always darker in there, even on bright days. The trees were tall and skinny, branches mostly near the tops, so everything below was just shadows and trunks and that faint smell of resin and damp dirt. I'd taken that shortcut through the trees 100 times before. It saved me maybe 5 minutes walking the road, and besides, I liked it. It was quiet, peaceful. You could hear birds sometimes or squirrels chattering, and your own footsteps sounded soft. That day, though, I noticed right away how quiet it was. Not just peaceful, but dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just this thick silence that felt like a blanket over my ears. It was one of those silences where you start to hear your own breathing a little too loud, and every step sounds like it's echoing. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured maybe it was just the weather or the time of day. I kept walking, head down, hands in the pocket of my hoodie. I had a stick I was dragging behind me, just scraping it along the path out of habit, not really thinking about anything. And then, about 20 feet ahead, I saw someone. At first, I couldn't tell exactly what I was looking at. It was so dim under the trees that everything kind of blended together. But as I got a little closer, I saw it was a kid sitting under one of the bigger pine trees off to the side of the trail. Just sitting there, hunched over, legs crossed. I slowed down without even realizing I had. There weren't a lot of kids that lived out there, not many my age anyway. I thought maybe it was one of the neighbor's cousins or someone visiting. I stepped off the path and walked toward him, still dragging my stick, still not thinking anything was weird yet. Just curious. He looked off. I stopped maybe 6 or 7 feet away and squinted, trying to make out his face. His head was down, almost resting on his chest, and he was messing with something in the dirt. I thought at first it was rocks or maybe little army men, but as I stepped closer, I saw they were little metal cars or wagons, kind of old-looking. The kind you'd see in antique shops, made of tin, with wheels that didn't roll right. He was wearing this old-fashioned-looking outfit. Not just dirty or hand-me-downs, but like something out of a book. Burlap or wool pants, stiff-looking and baggy. A dingy white button-up shirt, sleeves too short. The fabric looked coarse, like something no kid would wear by choice. His clothes were filthy, like he'd been sleeping in them for a week, mud and sap stains, frayed at the cuffs. His skin was pale, almost grayish, and his hair was dark and uncombed, hanging around his face in greasy clumps. He looked thin, not just skinny, but unhealthy. His arms were like sticks, elbows sharp and knees bony. I should have said something right then, but I just stood there. Something about him didn't sit right. I wasn't scared exactly, not yet, but it was like my brain didn't know how to process what I was looking at. I felt this weird twisting in my stomach, like I'd eaten something rotten. Then, all of a sudden, the air changed. It's hard to describe. It was like stepping into a freezer, like all the heat drained out of the air in a second. My skin prickled, and my head felt light. I went cold from the inside out. I remember my mouth started watering, and not in a good way. In that way it does right before you throw up. A wave of sickness came over me so fast I almost dropped my stick. My hands were shaking, and I had to take a step back to steady myself. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. All I could manage was a weak, "Hey." That's when he looked up. His face was wrong. There's no other word for it. Not because he was injured or disfigured, but because he didn't look like he belonged. His eyes were sunken, ringed in deep purple shadows, and his gaze was empty, like staring into a well that had no bottom. His expression didn't change, not even a flicker. Just dead eyes and a slack mouth. He didn't blink. He just stared straight through me, like I wasn't even there. Then, without a sound, he snatched up his little wagons, shot to his feet, and darted behind the tree. It happened so fast I barely saw it. 1 second he was sitting, the next he was gone. I didn't hear leaves crunch or branches move. Just silence. Complete, heavy silence. I stood there, rooted to the ground, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't breathing. I felt frozen, like if I moved, something bad would happen. But then the sickness lifted, just as quick as it had come. My stomach settled, my skin warmed up. The air felt normal again, like nothing had happened. Cautiously, I stepped forward to the tree, eyes scanning all around. There was nowhere to go, no trail, no bush thick enough to hide behind. I rounded the tree slowly, heart still pounding. He wasn't there. Gone. Just empty space. A patch of dirt and pine needles, a few scrapes in the soil where he'd been sitting, and faint impressions from where the little wagons had rolled. I stood there for a long time, longer than I probably should have. I kept circling the tree, looking around, checking behind other trunks, scanning the woods for movement. Nothing. No sound, no footsteps, no rustling, no birds. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I didn't run. I didn't even walk fast. I just turned and made my way back toward Nana's, slow and careful, like something might jump out if I moved too quick. Every step I took, I expected to see him pop out again from behind a tree or hear those metal toys clinking together. But there was nothing, just that eerie quiet, all the way to the backyard. When I stepped out of the trees and into the open space behind Nana's house, it was like stepping into another world. The air felt lighter. I could hear dogs barking faintly down the road, a car in the distance, someone hammering something a few houses over. Normal sounds, but I still felt off. My hands were still cold and clammy, my stomach still queasy. I didn't tell anyone. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't understand it myself. Maybe because I didn't want anyone to think I was making it up or going crazy. I just walked straight into the house, went to the bathroom, washed my hands even though they weren't dirty, and sat on the couch watching TV like nothing had happened. My Nana asked if I was feeling okay. I said I was tired. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept seeing his face when I closed my eyes. That blank, hollow stare. I thought I heard the sound of metal rolling on the floor once or twice. I sat up and looked around my room, but there was nothing there. Over the next few days, I kept thinking I'd dreamt it, that I'd imagined it, or maybe had a weird dizzy spell. But then about a week later, I took the same path again, broad daylight this time. I stopped at that same tree, half expecting to see him sitting there again. But all that was left were the faint indentations in the dirt, just barely visible, like someone had sat there a long time ago. I never saw him again. I kept walking that path over the years, growing older, learning to brush it off, telling myself it was just a weird encounter with some lost kid. Maybe he was playing some old-timey dress-up game. Maybe he was passing through and didn't belong there. But even now, I don't believe that. Not really. I've looked into it since. Talked to some older neighbors, asked questions in roundabout ways. Nobody ever mentioned a kid like that. No stories about strange kids passing through. No one missing. Just a patch of woods and a kid nobody else ever saw. But I saw him. I remember the smell of the dirt, the way the light looked through the trees, the sickness in my gut when he looked up at me. I remember all of it. And sometimes, when it's cloudy and quiet, and I'm walking alone, I still catch myself listening for the sound of tiny tin wheels scraping through the dirt. But I never hear it. I grew up in a one-room schoolhouse at the top of a hill in the middle of nowhere. I know how that sounds, like something out of a novel or an old-timey documentary, but it's true. The house sat alone on a sloping patch of land that once belonged to my great-aunt's husband's family. The whole hillside used to be part of a massive farm. Fields of grain, cattle, root cellars dug straight into the hill, stone walls that were half collapsed by the time I was old enough to notice them. The building that became our house was originally a grain storage shed, then turned into a schoolhouse somewhere around the mid-1800s. It shows up on a survey map from 1844, that much I've confirmed. I haven't been able to trace it back further than that. I tried, but local records before that are patchy and mostly lost to mold and fire. Anyway, we lived there because my mom inherited it through a tangle of family lines after my great-aunt passed. My mom didn't have much money, and the place was already ours, so we moved in and made it work. There wasn't much to it. One big room, high ceilings, big windows, and wide planks for floors that groaned under every step. At some point, someone had put in plumbing, sectioned off a bathroom and a little kitchen, and carved out a small bedroom from what had been the schoolmaster's nook. It was still one big room in spirit, though. You could stand in one corner and hear a whisper all the way across to the other. The wind howled differently up there, sharper maybe, or it just had more space to throw itself against the house. In the winter, the windows wept with condensation, and in the summer, the air got heavy and sticky. I hated it and loved it at the same time. That's hard to explain unless you've grown up in a place like that. It's home, even when it doesn't feel like it. There was a small walk-in closet at the back we called the library. It wasn't fancy, just a little square room with shelves that bowed under the weight of way too many books. Some were ours, some were left behind. It always smelled like dry paper and pine cleaner. The one window in there didn't fit right in the frame and was painted shut from decades ago. The kind of place you step into and feel like you shouldn't linger, though you can't say why. When I was 17, I had a small birthday party. I didn't have a lot of friends, but I invited 5 or 6 girls from school. It wasn't a wild party. We didn't drink or anything. We had cake, listened to music, painted each other's nails, gossiped. It was one of those humid summer nights where even the wind feels warm, and you keep sticking to your chair if you sit too long. At some point, someone pulled out a Ouija board. I honestly don't remember who brought it or where it came from. We were bored, and it seemed like the kind of creepy fun thing to do when you live in a weird old building with an even weirder past. I wasn't a big believer in ghosts or spirits or any of that, but I wasn't against the idea either. I think most of us were just curious. So we turned off the lights except for a couple candles and settled down around the board on the hardwood floor, cross-legged and buzzing with nerves. The second we put our fingers on the planchette, the air felt heavier. Not in a scary way at first, just like the silence changed shape. I figured someone was pushing it, maybe even unconsciously. But then the board started moving so fast we couldn't keep up. It wasn't just yes or no or slowly spelling out hi. It was full sentences, messages. I remember one of the girls scrambling to find a notebook to write it all down. I didn't think it was real, but it didn't feel fake either. It felt too fluid, too fast. Like whatever was spelling had a purpose, not just someone playing tricks. The board told us about a 12-year-old boy. It didn't give a name at first. Just said he had died trying to get into the schoolhouse one night. This house, when it was still a school. Said he'd been dared by friends to sneak in. Probably something stupid, like to steal the teacher's pointer stick or leave a frog on her desk. It said he pried open the window, one of the front ones, and it slammed down on his neck. Killed him instantly. That part made the girls go quiet. I remember my friend Ellie looking at me and mouthing, "Is that true?" I didn't know. I'd never heard the story before. Then the board said something that made me feel cold all over. It said he'd always watched over me. Said my smile reminded him of his sister Gertie's smile. That name stuck out, Gertie. Not a name kids have anymore. Not a name you'd make up on a whim. The board asked me to go to the library and open the window. We all just sat there for a minute, kind of stunned. I didn't want to do it. It wasn't like the board told me I had to, but something about it felt pointed, like he was waiting. So I got up, barefoot on the creaky floor, and walked to the library. The second I stepped through the doorway, it was like all the air drained out. The room wasn't cold, but I got chills up both arms and down my back. My legs went tight, like they didn't want to move. I stared at that window, still painted shut, still crooked in the frame, and all I could think about was how it must have looked the night that boy died. Moonlight, maybe. Wind picking up through the trees. Him out there on a dare, laughing. Then that snap. I turned and ran out of the room. I didn't care how it looked. I just ran back to the group and sat down like nothing happened. We stopped playing with the board after that. The party fizzled out a bit. People stayed the night, but slept in little groups, whispering about the boy and the name Gertie, and if it could all be real. A few days later, I decided to do my school history project on the house. I figured it would be easy, something I already lived in, with a clear history. Plus, I wanted to know if that story was real. I started digging through old newspaper archives online and asking around at the county clerk's office. Most of the clerks were unhelpful, but one older woman actually remembered hearing a story about a boy who died on the property. It wasn't in any official report because it happened too long ago, before mandatory death certificates, but someone had written it up in an old town newsletter. There was a paragraph about a 12-year-old boy who died trying to sneak into the schoolhouse at night. The article said the window had fallen and crushed his windpipe. His sister's name was Gertrude. I sat in the public library with my hands shaking, staring at the printout. I didn't know what to think. I still don't know. The details matched too perfectly to be coincidence. But I also know how memories get warped. How people want to believe in patterns and ghosts and things watching over us. The thing is, if that boy had been watching out for me, he didn't do a great job. My mom was a mean drunk. Not violent exactly, just cruel in a slow, grinding way. She'd call me names, ignore me for days, then cry and beg me not to leave her when I threatened to move out. But the worst part was her boyfriend. He moved in when I was 10 and stayed until I was almost 18. I won't get into too many details, but he was one of those people who could smile at a group of adults and then touch you too long when no one was looking. I spent 7 years trying to avoid him in a one-room house. I learned to fake sleep, to sleep facing the wall, to keep my clothes close and layered. I don't know if my mom knew. I think on some level she did. I think she just didn't want to believe it. So yeah, when the board said that boy had been watching over me, I felt angry. Still do sometimes. Like if he was real, if he was this caring ghost clinging to my smile. Where the hell was he when I needed help? Where was he when I cried into a pillow while footsteps passed by my door? Watching me doesn't count if you don't do anything about it. But I still apologize. Every time I go into the library to grab a book, I say, "Sorry I didn't open the window." I don't know why. I guess it's a reflex now, like muscle memory. Maybe I just don't want to be rude to the dead. Or maybe I still want to believe he's real, even if he wasn't much use. I don't know. I live in a different state now. I left a few months after I turned 18, packed a duffel bag and got out. I haven't been back to that house in years. Mom sold it when she finally got clean, and last I checked, someone turned it into an artist's retreat. They added skylights and painted the floors white, which I find sort of funny. The bones of that place are still the same, though. Still that old, heavy building with its secrets soaked into the walls. I wonder if the library still feels wrong, if the window's still stuck. I wonder if anyone else has tried to open it. I don't believe in ghosts the way I used to, but sometimes I think about that night, the way the board moved like it knew something we didn't, the way the air changed when I stepped into that little room, the way I ran without thinking. Maybe it was just fear. Maybe we scared ourselves with shadows and history. Maybe someone was pushing the planchette, even if they didn't know it. But Gertie wasn't a name you hear anymore, and I hadn't read that article yet. That part one can't explain. I guess that's what sticks with me. Not the fear. Not even the story. It's the not knowing. The hollow space between coincidence and meaning. That's the part that never lets go. It was a couple of years ago when I was on vacation with my family in Slovenia, in the town of Bled. We were staying at a hostel near the lake, a place that seemed friendly and welcoming during the day. The hostel was in the center of town, just a short walk from the lake and the castle. It had several dorm rooms, and we were all sharing one of them. My parents had one bed. My younger sister was on the couch at the end of my bed, and I was in a single bed near the window. The room was cozy, with wooden floors that creaked when you walked on them, and curtains that let in a bit of moonlight at night. On our second night there, I couldn't sleep. It was just past midnight, and the room was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old building settling. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the floor creak again. This time, it was different. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I turned my head toward the door, and in the dim light, I saw a silhouette of a man entering the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving slowly and quietly. He didn't make a sound, but the floor betrayed him with each step. I was frozen in bed, unable to move or speak. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. The man moved toward the couch where my sister was sleeping. He stood over her for a moment, and I could see him reaching out his hand. I wanted to scream, to jump out of bed and stop him, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the man turned his head and looked directly at me. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time stood still. He didn't say anything, but I could see the realization in his eyes that he had been caught. Without a word, he turned and quickly left the room, disappearing into the darkness. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I told my family what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I had imagined it, that it was just a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen. That day, we visited Bled Castle, perched high on a cliff overlooking the lake. The castle was beautiful, with its medieval architecture and stunning views. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The town, with its cobblestone streets and old buildings, felt like something out of a different time. It was charming during the day, but at night, it took on a different character. I didn't sleep well for the rest of our trip. Every night, I would lie in bed, listening for any sounds, watching the door. I never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It was a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, danger can lurk in the shadows. After we returned home, I did some research and found that Bled is generally a very safe place, with low crime rates. But that didn't change what had happened to me. I still don't know who the man was or what he intended to do, but I do know that I was lucky to have woken up when I did, and I learned to always trust my instincts, even when others don't believe me. It was a bitter cold night, colder than it had any right to be for that time of year. One of those sharp, dry nights where the air bites at your nose and ears the second you step outside, and every breath you take feels like it's burning your lungs a little. I had layered up, jeans, thick socks, boots, hoodie under my coat, but I still felt the cold settling deep in my bones as soon as I walked out the door. My two friends, Adam and Troy, were already waiting outside my apartment. Both had that tense body language that said they were trying to act like it wasn't that cold, but you could see them shivering a bit if you watched long enough. We were headed to this local dive bar about a mile or so away, the kind of place with sticky floors and dim lights and pool tables shoved into corners where nobody could really shoot straight. We'd made this plan the day before, walk to the bar, grab a couple beers, maybe some late-night food afterward. It wasn't a complicated night, just something to get out of the house and hang out a bit. None of us felt like dealing with parking or designated drivers, and the walk seemed doable. But barely 10 minutes into it, we started second-guessing. My fingers were already stiff inside my gloves, and I could feel the chill creeping under my coat collar. Adam's breath came in quick puffs, and Troy kept rubbing his hands together, muttering that we should have just grabbed a cab in the first place. When we got to the Royal Farm station, which sat right on the corner of a main road, we spotted a yellow cab parked off to the side. It was just sitting there, engine off, headlights dim. The driver looked like he was dozing off, head tilted down and hat pulled low. We hesitated for a second. None of us really liked waking people up, but the cold made the decision for us. Adam tapped on the window. The driver jerked awake, startled, then blinked a few times and motioned for us to get in. He didn't roll the window down or say anything, just gave a little hand wave like he wanted to get going. We didn't think much of it. Honestly, I was just grateful to be out of the cold. The cab smelled faintly of cigarettes and something sour, like spilled soda that had never been cleaned up. I climbed into the middle seat in the back. Adam took the spot behind the driver, and Troy sat behind the passenger seat. As soon as we shut the doors, the driver pulled out of the parking lot. He didn't say a word, not where to, or even a grunt, just drove. We figured he knew the bar. It wasn't far, and it was one of the more well-known spots in that part of town. But the direction he turned threw me off almost immediately. He pulled out into the lane going the opposite direction from where we'd been walking. At first I thought maybe he was going to take a different route or make a quick U-turn at the light. But he didn't. He kept going. Then he started weaving, not swerving wildly, but drifting back and forth across the lanes in this slow, deliberate S pattern. At first I thought maybe he was trying to avoid potholes, but there weren't any. It was smooth, dry asphalt, and we were in the middle of the street, no other cars around us. He drifted into the oncoming lane, then back to our lane, then back over again. No signal, no explanation, no sign that he even noticed he was doing it. just silent, steady weaving like he was tracing invisible lines with the tires. My heart rate picked up. I remember looking at the back of his head and feeling this tightness in my chest, like something was seriously wrong, but I couldn't figure out what yet. Adam leaned forward a little and said something. I don't remember what exactly, maybe something like, "Yo, man." But the driver didn't even flinch. Eyes forward, hands at 10 and 2, just drifting through the lanes like it was the most natural thing in the world. The fact that there wasn't any traffic coming toward us was a miracle. That part of town wasn't dead at night, but it was slow. We passed 2 gas stations and a strip mall, all closed. The occasional streetlight flickered overhead. It felt like we were in a bubble, like the whole world had disappeared except for this car and that man behind the wheel. We asked him to stop. Loudly. Adam said something about letting us out right there. Troy echoed it. I remember saying it too, my voice louder than I meant it to be. I was trying to stay calm, not cause a panic, but there was a definite edge in my tone. We all agreed. We didn't want to be in that car anymore. The driver didn't say a word. We reached a red light. Finally, he had to stop. The car rolled to a halt, and I saw the glow of the traffic light reflecting off the hood. It was the only moment I really felt like I had a chance to get out safely. The guys didn't hesitate. As soon as the car came to a full stop, both rear doors flew open. Adam and Troy bolted. I was in the middle, so I had to slide over. I got one leg out. My boot hit the pavement. I was halfway through the motion of standing when I felt the jolt. The car lurched forward. The driver had slammed the gas, running the red light like it wasn't even there. I lost my balance, my left leg still hanging out the open door. I grabbed the edge of the door and tried to hold it open with my foot. The wind roared past me. Cold air rushed in, slamming against my body like a wall. My fingers clenched the seat, my foot straining to keep the door from closing. The thought in my head was clear as day. If that door shut, I'd be locked in. And if I was locked in, I was stuck. With him. And I didn't know where we were going or what he planned to do. I screamed. Not words, just sound. Pure panic. The guys were yelling too, chasing after the cab, throwing whatever they had in their hands. Keys, water bottles, I think even a phone. I looked back and saw them getting smaller in the distance as the car sped up. I couldn't close the door, and I couldn't climb out without risking falling under the wheels. I just kept holding it open with my foot, using every bit of strength I had to keep myself halfway in, halfway out. Then the cab took a sharp turn. We veered off the main road onto a narrower street that ran alongside a row of parked cars. The driver didn't slow down. He didn't even hesitate. I could hear the tires squealing a little as we rounded the corner. Then came the sound of impact. Hard, metal-on-metal crunching. The kind of sound that goes through your bones. He had sideswiped the first parked car. Then the next. Then another. The entire right side of the cab, my side, was dragging and slamming against the parked vehicles, one after another. I could feel the door shaking against my leg. My boot scraped against one of the cars as we passed, and pain shot up my shin. It wasn't sharp, but deep and throbbing, like I'd been hit with a bat. I couldn't pull my leg in. I couldn't close the door. I couldn't jump. All I could do was hang on and pray we'd stop. Finally, another red light. The only thing that saved me. A car was already stopped ahead of us at the intersection. The cab couldn't go through it. Not unless he wanted to plow into another vehicle. We stopped behind it. For half a second, everything was still. The only sound was the engine idling and my own ragged breathing. My hands were numb. My leg throbbed. The right door was bent and dented, warped from the impacts. I couldn't get it open fully anymore. I knew I had seconds, maybe less. I lunged. I threw myself across the back seat, reached over the driver's shoulder, and yanked at the front door. Somehow it opened. I didn't stop to think. I didn't yell. I didn't even look back at his face. I just threw myself out, half rolling, half falling onto the pavement. I hit hard, palms first, then my hip. My knee scraped along the asphalt. I scrambled up and stumbled toward the curb, every part of my body shaking. Behind me, I heard tires squeal again. The cab sped off the second the light turned green, weaving into traffic like nothing had happened. By the time Adam and Troy caught up to me, I was leaning against a lamppost, trying to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to punch through my ribs. I couldn't feel my fingers. My right leg was bruised from ankle to thigh. The denim was scraped and stained from where I'd slammed against the parked cars. My palms were raw. My coat had a rip across the back from something I couldn't even remember hitting. The guys were gasping for air, red-faced and wide-eyed. Adam had a blurry photo on his phone. He'd tried to snap the plate, but it was too dark and the picture was too shaky. The numbers were unreadable. All we had was the make of the car and maybe a partial plate. It wasn't enough. We called 911. We waited. An officer came and took statements. Asked the same questions 3 or 4 different ways. I told the story as clearly as I could, every detail I could remember. They asked me if I wanted an ambulance. I said no, even though my leg felt like it was on fire. The officer said they'd look into it, that they'd check traffic cams and see if any other reports matched up. I never found out if they caught him. No follow-up call, no news report, nothing. It was like he just vanished. My leg was swollen for days. I had bruises the size of grapefruits, and walking was painful. But I was lucky. That's what everyone kept telling me. I was lucky, and I know they're right. I was lucky I didn't fall out. Lucky the light was red. Lucky there was another car in front of us. Lucky I didn't break anything. Lucky I got out. But that night lives in my head. Every time I step into a cab or an Uber now, I think about the silence. The way he didn't speak, didn't acknowledge us. Just drove. The way he made that decision, to run the red light, to take off with me still in the car. As if it didn't matter that I was screaming or that my friends were chasing us. Like I was already nothing to him. Just a body in his car. A problem to be dealt with later. That night changed how I see people. How I trust. How I move through the world. I never used to second-guess things like this. Getting into a cab, waking a driver, taking the fast way home. But now I do. Every time. Because I've learned that sometimes, the scariest things don't wear a mask or hide in the shadows. Sometimes they're just sitting behind the wheel, quiet. When I watched The Babadook for the first time, something about the ending sat deep in my chest. Not because it was scary in a typical horror movie way, but because I understood it. It wasn't about a monster living in the basement. It was about something darker, heavier, something many people live with in silence, depression. And that ending, where the mother comes to terms with it instead of trying to destroy it, made me think of my own past in a way I hadn't in years. I'm 25 now and haven't felt anything strange or out of place in a long time. But when I was between the ages of 12 and 16, there was something else living with us. Not a ghost or a demon, nothing like that, but something that fed off the same weight I was already carrying. Something that mirrored how I felt on the inside. We used to live in a 3-story apartment. The top floor was mine, my room, a bathroom, and a short hallway that opened to the staircase leading down to the living room and kitchen. My mom and I lived alone. We were close in the way that single-parent families often are. We shared a lot, but even so, I kept the worst parts of myself hidden from her. At first, the weird things seemed small. My mom would ask where I had put things. Papers she left on the table, pens, keys, even her coffee cup once. At first, she assumed I'd moved them and forgotten. I didn't blame her for thinking that. I was 12, and kids misplace things all the time. But then some of my things started to vanish too. Small, personal things like my favorite pen or a notebook I always kept by my bed. We looked, but we never found them. I remember thinking it was strange, but I didn't feel scared. At that point, it was just confusing. The television would turn off on its own sometimes. Once it flicked off in the middle of a show, and then back on after a few minutes. We thought maybe there was something wrong with the power or the remote. We weren't superstitious people. It didn't cross either of our minds that something was wrong with the apartment, so we shrugged it off. But as I turned 13 and started to feel worse inside myself, the strange things got more intense. I've never had the right words to describe depression when I was that age. I didn't know what it was, not really. I just knew I felt heavy, as if everything was harder than it should be. Getting up in the morning felt like dragging my body through mud. Sometimes I cried for no reason, especially at night. I remember waking up one night, overwhelmed with sadness, and starting to cry into my pillow. And then I felt something. A hand, or what felt like a hand, gently brushing my cheek, the way adults do when they try to calm a crying child. I remember the exact sensation. The fingers were warm, slow, careful. I wasn't scared. It actually calmed me down. I fell asleep almost immediately after. That wasn't the only time something strange happened. One afternoon, a friend came over. We were standing in the small hallway outside my room when we heard someone run up and down the stairs. loud footsteps, fast, almost like stomping. My friend looked at me with wide eyes, her face pale. She asked who it was, but we were the only ones home. We both stood there for a while listening. It didn't happen again that day, but I could tell she didn't want to stay upstairs after that. She kept glancing over her shoulder. She left early, and I remember feeling embarrassed, but I couldn't blame her. A few days later, I was home alone. My mom had gone to run errands, and I was in my room with the door open. I was just lying on my bed, listening to music. I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock downstairs. I paused my music and listened. The door opened, then closed. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, the slow kind, like someone walking with purpose. I called out for my mom, assuming she'd come back early, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped at the second floor. I waited, then called again. Still nothing. I got up and looked down the stairs. The lower floors were empty. The door was shut. I even walked down and checked the door, the lock, everything. Nothing looked off. It was locked again. I went back to my room feeling cold all over, like my skin was too tight. I didn't sleep well that night. After that, I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the apartment, even when no one else was home. It was more than a feeling. I'd catch movement in the corners of my eyes, shadows that didn't match anything. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but my mom started mentioning it too. She said she'd see something move across the kitchen floor or feel like someone was behind her when she was brushing her teeth. We didn't talk about it often. I think we both felt that if we didn't give it too much attention, it would go away. But it didn't. As my depression got worse, the atmosphere in the apartment changed. I know that sounds strange, but it really did. The air felt heavier. The silence felt different. I stopped inviting friends over. I didn't want to explain the strange noises or the way the lights sometimes flickered when I was upset. I started spending more and more time alone in my room. I was cutting by then, small at first, just enough to feel something, then deeper, then more often. I hid the scars under long sleeves and avoided eye contact with my mom when she asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired. I told her school was hard. I didn't tell her that I had already started planning how I might die. One day, my mom told me she saw a white fog move up the stairs to my floor. She wasn't one to say things like that, and I remember the way she looked when she told me. She wasn't scared. She looked concerned, like something wasn't right, and she didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know either. At that point, I was too far inside my own darkness to feel anything clearly. Then came the worst night. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I wasn't tired. My mind was racing with thoughts that wouldn't stop. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. And then I heard it. Breathing. Deep, slow, heavy breathing coming from the couch at the foot of my bed. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't the building creaking or the wind, or anything else I could make sense of. It was low and rough, like someone had been running and was trying to calm their breath. I lay still, frozen. My body wouldn't move. I stared into the dark, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It kept going, slow and steady. I watched the time crawl by on my clock. 2 hours passed. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. When I finally forced myself to get up and run out of the room, the breathing got quieter as I moved. But as soon as I reached the hallway, it got louder again. Louder than before, almost angry. I ran down the stairs and found my mom. She let me sleep in her room that night. When she went to check my room, she didn't find anything. But she said she heard the breathing too, just for a moment. After that, I heard the breathing more often. Not every night, but enough that I started to dread going to sleep. I kept the light on sometimes. I started closing the curtains, even during the day, because I kept seeing strange flashes of light outside the windows. Not lightning, not reflections, just bright flashes that didn't belong. I tried to explain it away. I read that flashes could be related to migraines, but I never had headaches. The lights didn't hurt. They didn't even scare me after a while. They were just another thing I couldn't explain. By the time I was 15, I had already tried to take my own life once. I didn't succeed, obviously, but I remember feeling disappointed that I woke up. I felt like whatever was in that apartment wasn't just living with me. It was part of me. It fed off the same pain I was drowning in, and it was always there, quiet but constant, like a shadow just behind my shoulder. I never gave it a name. I didn't think of it as a ghost or a demon. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was more like an extension of how I felt, a physical echo of something deeply wrong inside me. And as my thoughts got darker, so did the apartment. Even my mom noticed it. She said the air upstairs felt different. She started sleeping with her door locked, not because she was afraid of me, but because she said the house didn't feel right at night. When I turned 16, something shifted. I don't know what caused it. Maybe it was therapy finally starting to help. Maybe it was the medications I was taking. Maybe it was just time. But I started to feel slightly better. Not happy, but less broken. The cutting stopped. The suicidal thoughts got less frequent. I started going outside more, talking to people, smiling, even if it didn't feel real yet. And as I got better, the strange things in the apartment started to disappear. The breathing stopped. The flashes of light faded. The feeling of being watched went away. It wasn't instant. It took months. But the change was clear. My mom noticed it too. One day, she said it felt like the apartment had exhaled, like it had been holding its breath for years and finally let go. I knew exactly what she meant. We moved out when I was 18. It wasn't because of what happened. It was just time to move on. We got a smaller place closer to where I was going to school. Life got better slowly. I don't hear things anymore. I don't feel anything strange in the corners of my eyes. I don't see flashes of light, and I don't lie awake at night listening for breathing that isn't there. Looking back, I don't think that apartment was haunted in the traditional sense. I think my depression filled that space so fully that it changed the way we experienced it. I think pain can do that. It stretches out and touches everything, especially when it's unspoken and raw. I think whatever we felt in that apartment was real, but it came from me, from the sadness I carried in every cell of my body during those years. And when I started healing, it left. Maybe it was never there in the way people imagine. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know I'll never forget what it felt like to live with something that grew stronger the weaker I got. But I'm still here. And whatever that thing was,